Good evening. You're standing in what was once the beating heart of one of humanity's most sophisticated civilizations. But now the jungle has reclaimed its prize. Massive limestone pyramids pierce through a canopy so thick it blocks out the sun, their steps worn smooth by a million bare feet that will never climb them again. The air hangs heavy with humidity and the weight of unanswered questions. Somewhere in the distance, a howler monkey's call echoes through the ruins, a sound that might have been the last thing the Maya heard before their world went silent. This is Tikal, or El Mirador, or any of dozens of ghost cities scattered across Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico, cities that once housed hundreds of thousands of people, where the smoke of countless cooking fires once rose to mingle with incense from temple ceremonies, where the sound of children playing mixed with the chants of priests and the clash of obsidian weapons. Now there's only the whisper of wind through empty doorways and the slow, patient work of roots cracking apart the monuments to human ambition. What you're looking at is one of history's greatest magic tricks. An entire civilization, one that had mastered mathematics while Europe was still figuring out basic agriculture, simply vanished. Not gradually, not with the slow decline you might expect from a dying empire, but with the sudden finality of a candle being snuffed out. The Maya didn't just fall, they evaporated, leaving behind empty cities and a mystery that has haunted archaeologists for over a century. Tonight, we're going to dive deep into this enigma, exploring how a civilization that could predict eclipses centuries in advance somehow failed to see their own end coming. We'll examine their breathtaking achievements in science, art, and architecture, achievements that make our modern world look almost primitive by comparison. We'll delve into their darker side too, the blood-soaked rituals and endless wars that may have planted the seeds of their own destruction. And we'll explore the theories, some plausible, some bizarre, about what could cause an entire civilization to simply stop existing. But here's the thing that should keep you awake tonight. If it happened to them, with all their knowledge and sophistication, what makes us think it couldn't happen to us? Before we begin this journey into one of history's most unsettling mysteries, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, and whether it feels more like dawn breaking over the pyramids of Tikal or midnight in the depths of the Petan jungle. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because unlike the Maya, this channel promises not to mysteriously vanish without explanation. The story of the Maya begins not with their disappearance, but with their impossible rise from the swamps and jungles of Mesoamerica. To understand how spectacular their fall was, you first need to grasp just how high they had climbed. We're talking about a civilization that emerged from some of the most challenging terrain on Earth and turned it into the foundation for one of humanity's greatest achievements. The Maya didn't have it easy. While other great civilizations built their empires in fertile river valleys, like the Nile or Mesopotamia, the Maya chose to make their home in what can only be described as nature's obstacle course. Dense tropical rainforests where a machete becomes useless after 20 feet of hacking through vines, swamplands that could swallow a person whole, limestone terrain so porous that surface water simply disappears, leaving communities dependent on underground cenotes and seasonal rainfall that could fail without warning. Yet somehow, starting around 2000 BCE, small groups of hunter-gatherers looked at this green hell and thought, you know what? This looks like prime real estate. They began the slow, back-breaking work of turning jungle into farmland, swamp into cities, and chaos into one of the most sophisticated civilizations the world has ever seen. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For over 1,000 years, these early Maya developed the foundations that would support their later achievements. They learned to read the rhythms of the rainforest, to predict the rains, to find water in a landscape that seemed determined to hide it. They developed a form of agriculture so efficient it could support population densities that wouldn't be seen again in the region until the 20th century. But perhaps most importantly, they developed something that would set them apart from almost every other civilization in human history. A writing system, not just simple pictographs or basic record keeping, but a fully developed script capable of recording everything from grocery lists to epic poetry, from astronomical observations to the intimate details of royal scandals. While most of the world was still relying on oral tradition and memory, the Maya were creating libraries. By the time we reach what archaeologists call the Classic Period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, the Maya had built something that would have made the Romans weep with envy. Cities that stretched for miles, connected by raised stone causeways that cut straight through the jungle like ancient highways. Pyramids that soared higher than anything in Europe wouldn't build for another 1,000 years. Palaces decorated with art so sophisticated that modern museums fight wars to acquire even fragments. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. All of this magnificence, all of these achievements that should have guaranteed the Maya a place among history's eternal civilizations, were built on a foundation that was far more fragile than anyone realized. The very innovations that allowed them to thrive in the jungle also made them vulnerable to forces they couldn't control and apparently couldn't see coming. The Maya had solved the puzzle of how to build a civilization in the rainforest, but they had also created a system so complex, so dependent on perfect balance, that the slightest disruption could bring the whole thing crashing down. And crash it did, with a thoroughness that still leaves archaeologists scratching their heads and wondering how something so magnificent could simply cease to exist. As we stand in these ruins today, surrounded by the ghosts of a lost world, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Maya weren't primitive people who got lucky for a few centuries. They were sophisticated, intelligent, and innovative. They had science, art, literature, and technology that in many ways surpassed anything their contemporaries could imagine. If they could vanish so completely, so suddenly, what does that say about the permanence of our own civilization? The jungle has been patient with the Maya. It waited while they built their pyramids and carved their stele while they mapped the stars and wrote their books. And when they were gone, it simply reclaimed what had always been its own, wrapping their achievements in green silence and leaving us to wonder what went wrong. But before we can understand their end, we need to understand their beginning, and just how impossible their rise really was. Because the story of the Maya isn't just about how a civilization disappeared. It's about how one of humanity's greatest achievements emerged from what should have been impossible circumstances, flourished beyond all reasonable expectations, and then vanished as if it had never existed at all. The mystery isn't just what happened to the Maya. The mystery is how they managed to exist in the first place. The first thing you need to understand about the Maya is that they shouldn't have existed at all. When you look at a map of where great civilizations typically emerge, you'll notice a pattern. They cluster around rivers, fertile plains, and areas where nature makes life relatively easy. The Egyptians had the Nile's predictable floods. The Mesopotamians had the Tigris and Euphrates. The Chinese had the Yellow River Valley. The Maya, they had mosquitoes, jaguars, and a climate that could charitably be described as aggressively hostile to human habitation. The Peton rainforest, where the heart of Maya civilization would eventually beat, receives over 150 inches of rain per year. To put that in perspective, London gets about 25 inches annually, and Londoners complain about the weather constantly. But here's the cruel joke. Despite all that rainfall, finding drinking water in the Maya lowlands can be nearly impossible. The limestone bedrock acts like a giant sponge, absorbing water so efficiently that rivers simply vanish into the ground. Surface water exists mainly in scattered cenotes, natural sinkholes that drop into underground cave systems, and seasonal pools that disappear the moment the rains stop. Imagine trying to plan a city when your water supply might literally evaporate overnight. Imagine building a civilization where the difference between abundance and catastrophe could be measured in inches of rainfall. This wasn't just challenging, It was borderline insane. Yet the Maya not only survived in this environment, they turned it into the foundation for one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The secret lay in their relationship with corn, or maize as it's properly called. But calling what the Maya did with corn agriculture is like calling Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel interior decorating. The Maya didn't just grow corn, they engineered it, shaped it, and turned it into the backbone of a civilization that would eventually support millions of people. Wild corn, or teosinte, looks nothing like the golden ears we know today. It's a scraggly grass with seeds so small and hard you'd break your teeth trying to eat them. Somehow, through centuries of careful selection and cultivation, the Maya transformed this unpromising weed into a crop so productive it could support population densities that wouldn't be seen again in the region until the arrival of modern industrial agriculture. But they didn't stop there. The Maya developed a farming technique called the milpa system, a form of rotating agriculture so sophisticated that modern permaculture enthusiasts study it with religious devotion. They would clear a section of forest, burn the debris to create nutrient-rich ash, then plant corn, beans, and squash together in a combination that would make any modern agricultural scientist weep with envy. The corn provided carbohydrates and grew tall, creating natural poles. The beans climbed the corn stalks and fixed nitrogen in the soil, essentially fertilizing the other crops. The squash spread along the ground, its broad leaves shading the soil to retain moisture and prevent weeds. It was a closed-loop system that actually improved the soil over time, rather than depleting it. The Maya had essentially invented sustainable agriculture 2,000 years before the term existed. They also developed raised field systems in swampy areas, creating artificial islands of fertile soil surrounded by canals that provided fish, controlled flooding, and created microclimates that extended growing seasons. In the northern Yucatan, where the soil was too thin for traditional farming, they built elaborate terraces and created artificial soil by composting organic matter in stone-lined pits. The result was an agricultural revolution that could support population densities of up to 2,000 people per square mile in some areas. To put that in perspective, that's denser than many modern suburbs. The Maya had turned one of the world's most challenging environments into a garden that could feed millions. But agriculture was just the beginning. While they were revolutionizing farming, the Maya were also developing innovations that would make them the intellectual giants of the ancient Americas. They created a writing system so complex that scholars are still deciphering it today. A mathematical system that included the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe, and a calendar so accurate that it's more precise than the one we use today. Their astronomical observations were so detailed and accurate that they could predict eclipses, track the movements of Venus, and calculate the length of the solar year too within minutes of our modern measurements. They built observatories that aligned with celestial events and created tables that tracked planetary movements across centuries. All of this without telescopes, without metal tools, without even the wheel for transportation. The Maya also developed a sophisticated understanding of medicine, performing surgical procedures that included trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. They had an extensive pharmacological knowledge, using hundreds of plants for medicinal purposes, many of which are still used in modern medicine today. Their architecture was equally impressive. Maya engineers learned to build massive structures without metal tools, using only stone implements and human labor. They developed a form of concrete made from limestone that was so durable that their buildings have survived over 1,000 years of jungle growth. They created complex water management systems, including reservoirs, canals, and drainage systems that could handle the extreme variations in rainfall that characterized their environment. But perhaps most remarkably, they did all of this while maintaining a complex political system that spanned hundreds of independent city-states across an area larger than modern Germany. These weren't simple tribal societies. but sophisticated urban centers with populations that could reach into the hundreds of thousands. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Karakol were metropolises that would have impressed visitors from Rome or Constantinople. The Maya had created something unprecedented, a tropical civilization. While other great cultures built their achievements in temperate climates or desert oases, the Maya had conquered the rainforest and turned it into the foundation for one of humanity's greatest intellectual and artistic achievements. Yet, even as they were reaching these heights, the seeds of their destruction were already being planted. The very success of their agricultural system was creating pressures that would eventually prove unsustainable. The population growth that their innovations made possible was pushing the limits of what even their sophisticated farming techniques could support. The political complexity that allowed them to manage hundreds of independent cities was also creating tensions that would eventually tear their civilization apart. The Maya had solved the impossible puzzle of how to build a civilization in the jungle. But in doing so, they had created new puzzles that would prove even more challenging. They had turned the rainforest into a garden, but gardens require constant tending, and the Maya were about to discover that even the most sophisticated civilization could be brought low by forces beyond their control. The stage was set for one of history's greatest tragedies, the collapse of a civilization that had achieved the impossible, only to discover that the impossible comes with a price that eventually must be paid. To understand how the Maya could vanish so completely, you need to understand what they were really like at their peak. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the Maya weren't the peaceful, nature-loving astronomers that popular culture often portrays. They were brilliant, sophisticated, and absolutely ruthless. They built one of history's most advanced civilizations on a foundation of blood, war, and human sacrifice that would make the Aztecs look like pacifists. The Maya practiced human sacrifice not as an occasional ritual, but as a central organizing principle of their society. We're not talking about the quick, merciful deaths you might imagine. Maya sacrifice was an art form, a theatrical performance designed to extract maximum suffering while honoring the gods who demanded payment in human agony. They had dozens of different methods, each tailored to specific deities and occasions. Heart extraction was perhaps the most common, but the Maya elevated it to a level of precision that would impress modern surgeons. The victim would be painted blue, the color of sacrifice, then held down on a curved stone altar, while a priest used an obsidian knife to cut through the chest wall. The heart would be removed while still beating and offered to the gods, while the body was thrown down the temple steps to waiting crowds below. The blood was collected in special vessels and used to anoint sacred objects and temple walls. But that was just the beginning. The Maya also practiced flaying, where victims were skinned alive and priests would wear their skin during subsequent rituals. They had drowning ceremonies where victims were thrown into notes, the sacred wells that provided water for their cities. Children were particularly prized for these water sacrifices, as their tears were believed to encourage the rain gods to weep and bring the rains. Perhaps most disturbing was the practice of auto-sacrifice, where Maya nobles would pierce their own tongues, earlobes, and genitals with stingray spines and obsidian blades, collecting the blood on bark paper that was then burned to send messages to the gods. Royal women were expected to pull thorned ropes through holes in their tongues during important ceremonies, their blood mixing with copal incense to create sacred smoke. The Maya ball game, played in courts found in every major city, wasn't just sport, but a ritual reenactment of cosmic battles between the forces of life and death. The losing team, or sometimes the winning team, depending on the occasion, would be sacrificed at the end of the game. Decapitation was common, with the heads sometimes used as bulls in subsequent games. These weren't the actions of a primitive society driven by superstition. The Maya understood anatomy better than most medieval European physicians. They could perform complex surgical procedures and had detailed knowledge of human physiology. Their sacrifice rituals were carefully planned theatrical events that required extensive knowledge of human anatomy to execute properly. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it with scientific precision. But here's what makes the Maya truly fascinating and terrifying. They combined this casual brutality with intellectual achievements that wouldn't be matched for centuries. The same priests who were flaying victims alive were also making astronomical observations of stunning accuracy. The same rulers who ordered mass sacrifices were also commissioning mathematical treatises and architectural marvels. Maya mathematics was so advanced that they independently developed the concept of zero, something that didn't appear in European mathematics until it was borrowed from India centuries later. They used a base 20 number system that allowed them to perform calculations involving millions and billions. Their mathematical texts show they understood concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Their calendar system was even more impressive. The Maya actually used multiple interlocking calendars simultaneously: a 260-day sacred calendar, a 365-day solar calendar, and a long count that could track dates across millions of years. They calculated the length of the solar year as 365.2420 days, compared to our modern measurement of 365.2422 days. They were off by less than 2 minutes per year. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of Venus so precisely that they could predict its appearances as morning and evening star centuries in advance. They knew that Venus had a cycle of 584 days and incorporated this knowledge into their warfare planning, timing major battles to coincide with Venus's appearances as the war star. They identified and named constellations, tracked the movements of Mars and Jupiter, and even detected the wobble in the moon's orbit. Their writing system was equally sophisticated. Maya hieroglyphs weren't just simple picture writing, but a complex system that combined logographic and syllabic elements, allowing them to record everything from historical chronicles to poetry to mathematical calculations. They wrote on bark paper books called codices, carved inscriptions on stone monuments, and painted texts on pottery and walls. The content of these texts reveals a society obsessed with history, genealogy, and the precise recording of events. Maya scribes recorded the births, deaths, marriages, and military victories of rulers with meticulous detail. They wrote epic poems about the adventures of gods and heroes. They created detailed astronomical tables and mathematical treatises. They even recorded what we would recognize as early forms of science fiction, stories about journeys to other worlds and encounters with supernatural beings. But they also recorded, with the same meticulous detail, the capture and sacrifice of enemies, the ritual torture of prisoners, and the divine mandate that required constant offerings of human blood to keep the universe functioning. To the Maya, there was no contradiction between intellectual sophistication and ritual brutality. Both were necessary components of a properly ordered cosmos. This combination of brilliance and brutality extended to their warfare as well. Maya military tactics were sophisticated and effective, involving complex strategies, coordinated attacks, and the use of specialized weapons and fortifications. They fought not just for territory or resources, but for captives who could be sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies that validated the divine authority of their rulers. Maya cities were constantly at war with each other, forming shifting alliances and engaging in conflicts that could last for generations. These weren't simple raids or border skirmishes, but complex military campaigns involving thousands of warriors and sophisticated siege tactics. The goal wasn't necessarily to destroy enemy cities, but to capture their rulers and important nobles for sacrifice, thereby demonstrating the superiority of the victorious city's gods. The irony is that this very sophistication, this combination of intellectual achievement and ritual violence, may have contributed to their eventual downfall. The Maya had created a system so complex, so dependent on precise timing and careful balance, that any disruption could cascade into catastrophe. Their agricultural innovations allowed them to support massive populations, but those populations required constant expansion and intensification of farming. Their political system allowed them to coordinate activities across vast distances, but it also created endless opportunities for conflict and instability. Most importantly, their religious system, with its emphasis on blood sacrifice and divine kingship, created a society that was inherently unstable. Maya rulers derived their authority from their ability to communicate with the gods and ensure cosmic order through ritual sacrifice. But what happened when the rains failed, when crops died, when the carefully calculated astronomical events didn't bring the expected results? The Maya had built a civilization that was simultaneously one of humanity's greatest achievements and a house of cards waiting for the right wind to bring it all crashing down. They had reached heights of intellectual and artistic achievement that wouldn't be matched for centuries. But they had done so while creating a system so fragile that it contained the seeds of its own destruction. The blood that flowed down their temple steps wasn't just an offering to the gods. It was a warning about what happens when brilliance and brutality combine to create something too complex for its own good. By 600 CE, the Maya had accomplished something that should have been impossible. They had built Manhattan in the middle of the Amazon. Well, not literally Manhattan, but cities that were just as densely populated, just as architecturally ambitious, and far more sophisticated than anything Europe would produce for another 500 years. These weren't the small ceremonial centers that early archaeologists imagined, but sprawling metropolises that housed hundreds of thousands of people in the heart of the rainforest. Tikal, in what is now Guatemala, covered over 575 square kilometers and housed an estimated 100,000 people at its peak. To put that in perspective, that's larger than modern Atlanta and more populous than most medieval European cities. The city's central core alone contained over 3,000 structures dating from 600 BCE to 900 CE, including 6 large stepped pyramids, the tallest of which soared 65 meters above the jungle floor, making it taller than anything built in the Americas until the modern era. But Tikal was just one of dozens of major Maya cities. Calakmul Tikal's great rival may have been even larger, with a population that could have reached 200,000 at its height. El Mirador, built even earlier, contained pyramids that dwarfed anything at Tikal, including La Danta, a massive complex that rises 72 meters above the forest floor and contains more stone and mortar than the Great Pyramid of Giza. These cities weren't just big, they were impossibly sophisticated. Maya urban planners created complex water management systems that collected and stored rainwater in massive reservoirs, some capable of holding millions of gallons. They built raised causeways that connected different parts of their cities and linked them to other urban centers, creating transportation networks that stretched for hundreds of kilometers through dense jungle. The engineering required for these projects was staggering. Maya builders had to move millions of tons of stone without wheeled vehicles or large domesticated animals. They quarried limestone blocks weighing several tons each and transported them using only human labor, wooden rollers, and rope. They developed a form of concrete made from crushed limestone that was so durable that their structures have survived over 1,000 years of jungle growth, earthquakes, and hurricanes. Maya architects understood principles of engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for centuries. They built true arches using a corbelling technique that distributed weight so effectively their buildings could support multiple stories. They created complex drainage systems that prevented water damage during the intense rainy seasons. They even incorporated acoustic engineering into their designs, building structures that could amplify sound so that a person speaking normally at the top of a pyramid could be heard clearly by crowds gathered hundreds of meters away. The artistic sophistication of these cities was equally impressive. Maya sculptors created works of art that rival anything produced in classical Greece or Rome. Their relief carvings tell complex stories involving gods, rulers, and historical events, executed with a level of detail and artistic skill that leaves modern viewers stunned. They developed a distinctive artistic style that combined naturalistic representation with symbolic complexity, creating works that function simultaneously as historical records, religious texts, and aesthetic masterpieces. Maya painters decorated the walls of palaces and temples with murals that depicted everything from court ceremonies to mythological scenes to detailed battle narratives. The murals at Bonampak, discovered in the 1940s, show Maya warriors in elaborate costumes capturing enemies in battle, then presenting them to rulers for sacrifice. The level of detail is so precise that archaeologists can identify specific individuals, read the hieroglyphic texts that accompany the scenes, and even determine the exact dates when the events depicted took place. But perhaps, most remarkably, the Maya accomplished all of this while maintaining their cities in one of the world's most challenging environments. The tropical rainforest doesn't just make construction difficult, it actively tries to destroy anything humans build. Humidity rots wood, roots crack stone, and the constant growth of vegetation can reduce a building to rubble in just a few decades if it's not constantly maintained. The Maya solved this problem through sheer determination and sophisticated maintenance systems. They developed techniques for protecting their buildings from moisture damage, created drainage systems that prevented water from accumulating around foundations, and maintained armies of workers whose job was to constantly repair and maintain their urban infrastructure. They also learned to work with the forest rather than against it. Maya cities weren't cleared spaces carved out of the jungle, but integrated urban environments that incorporated existing trees and natural features into their designs. They created urban forests, carefully managed green spaces that provided food, building materials, and habitat for the animals they hunted, all while maintaining the complex ecosystem services that made their cities viable. The result was a form of urbanism that was completely unique in human history. Maya cities were simultaneously artificial and natural, massive human constructions that were also functioning ecosystems. They had solved the puzzle of how to build large permanent settlements in an environment that seemed designed to prevent exactly that kind of development. But this success came at a cost that the Maya may not have fully understood. Their cities required constant inputs of labor, materials, and food to maintain. The larger they grew, the more resources they consumed, and the more vulnerable they became to any disruption in the complex systems that kept them functioning. Maya cities were also incredibly hierarchical. The massive pyramids and palaces at their centers weren't just religious and administrative buildings. They were statements of power that required enormous investments of labor and resources to construct and maintain. The rulers who commissioned these projects lived in luxury that would have impressed Roman emperors, surrounded by elaborate courts that included hundreds of nobles, priests, scribes, artists, and servants. The common people who made all of this possible lived in much simpler circumstances, in small houses built around courtyards, often without access to the elaborate water management systems that served the elite districts. They provided the labor that built the pyramids, the food that fed the cities, and the soldiers that fought the endless wars between competing urban centers. This inequality wasn't just economic, it was cosmic. Maya ideology held that rulers were divine beings, living gods who maintained the balance between the human and supernatural worlds through their ritual activities. The elaborate ceremonies, the human sacrifices, the astronomical observations, all of these were seen as necessary activities that only properly trained and divinely sanctioned rulers could perform. But what happened when the system stopped working? What occurred when the rains failed, when crops died, when the carefully maintained balance between human needs and environmental limits was disrupted. The Maya had built cities that were marvels of engineering and urban planning, but they had also created a civilization that was completely dependent on the continued functioning of incredibly complex and fragile systems. The very sophistication that made Maya cities possible also made them vulnerable. They had created urban environments that could support hundreds of thousands of people in the middle of the rainforest. But they had done so by pushing the limits of what their environment could sustain. They had built a civilization that was simultaneously one of humanity's greatest achievements and a disaster waiting to happen. The stone pyramids that still pierce the jungle canopy today are monuments to human ambition and ingenuity. But they're also tombstones marking the graves of cities that grew too large, too complex, and too dependent on systems that couldn't be maintained forever. The Maya had built cities of stone and shadow, and in the end, it was the shadows that won. While Maya priests were ripping hearts from living chests, Maya mathematicians were making calculations that wouldn't be matched in accuracy for another 1,000 years. This wasn't a contradiction in their minds, it was a necessity. To the Maya, mathematics wasn't just an abstract intellectual exercise. It was a tool for understanding and controlling the universe itself. And that universe, as they understood it, was a place where cosmic order could only be maintained through precise calculations and regular offerings of human blood. The Maya developed their mathematical system not in ivory towers, but in the blood-soaked temples where they performed their most sacred rituals. Every sacrifice had to be timed precisely according to astronomical events. Every ritual had to be performed at exactly the right moment in the complex cycles that governed Maya religious life. Get the timing wrong, and the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for individuals, but for entire cities. This practical need for precision drove the Maya to mathematical innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. They independently developed the concept of zero, something that didn't appear in European mathematics until it was borrowed from India in the 12th century. But the Maya weren't just using zero as a placeholder, they understood it as a mathematical concept, a number that could be manipulated and used in calculations. Their number system was based on 20 rather than 10, probably because they counted on both fingers and toes. This vigesimal system actually has some advantages over our decimal system, particularly for certain types of calculations. It allowed the Maya to work with very large numbers more easily, and their mathematical texts show calculations involving millions and billions, numbers so large that most contemporary civilizations couldn't even conceive of them. But the real genius of Maya mathematics lay in how they applied it to understanding time and space. The Maya didn't just track time, they dissected it, analyzed it, and turned it into a tool for predicting and controlling the future. Their calendar system was so complex that it makes our modern calendar look like a child's toy. The Maya used multiple calendars simultaneously, each tracking different cycles and serving different purposes. The Tzolk'in was a 260-day sacred calendar that combined 20-day names with 13 numbers, creating a cycle that was used for religious ceremonies and divination. The Hob was a 365-day solar calendar that tracked the agricultural year. These two calendars meshed together like gears in a cosmic machine, creating a 52-year cycle called the calendar round. But that was just the beginning. The Maya also used a long count calendar that could track dates across millions of years. This wasn't just theoretical, they actually used it to record historical events and make predictions about the future. Maya inscriptions record dates that stretch back to the creation of the current world, which they calculated as occurring on August 11th, 3114 BCE in our calendar. The precision of Maya timekeeping was extraordinary. They calculated the length of the solar year as 365.2420 days, compared to our modern measurement of 365.24 to 2 days. They were off by less than 2 minutes per year, a level of accuracy that wasn't achieved in Europe until the development of modern astronomical instruments. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of celestial bodies with obsessive precision. They knew that Venus had a synodic period of 584 days and could predict its appearances as morning and evening star centuries in advance. They tracked the movements of Mars, Jupiter, and Mercury. They identified and named constellations, many of which were different from those recognized by other cultures. Most remarkably, they detected and calculated the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in Earth's rotation that causes the position of stars to shift over thousands of years. This is an incredibly subtle astronomical phenomenon that requires centuries of careful observation to detect. The fact that the Maya not only noticed it, but calculated its rate, shows a level of astronomical sophistication that rivals modern science. But here's where the story gets dark. The Maya used all of this mathematical and astronomical knowledge not just for intellectual satisfaction, but to determine when and how to kill people. Their astronomical tables weren't just scientific documents, they were instruction manuals for human sacrifice. Venus's appearance as the morning star was considered an auspicious time for warfare and the capture of prisoners for sacrifice. Eclipses required specific rituals to prevent cosmic catastrophe. The end of calendar cycles demanded massive sacrificial ceremonies to ensure the world would continue to exist. Maya rulers used their mathematical knowledge to legitimize their power and justify their actions. They could predict eclipses and claim credit for making the sun return. They could calculate when Venus would appear and time military campaigns to coincide with favorable astronomical events. They could use the complex calendar system to determine auspicious dates for everything from royal marriages to the dedication of new temples. This combination of mathematical sophistication and ritual violence created a system that was both incredibly powerful and inherently unstable. Maya rulers derived their authority from their ability to understand and manipulate cosmic forces through mathematical calculation and ritual sacrifice. But this system only worked as long as their predictions proved accurate and their rituals produced the desired results. What happened when the carefully calculated astronomical events didn't bring the expected rains? What occurred when the precisely timed sacrifices failed to prevent crop failures or military defeats? The Maya had created a system where mathematical precision was supposed to guarantee cosmic order, but they had also created expectations that no amount of calculation could fulfill. The Maya mathematical system was also incredibly complex, requiring years of training to master. Only a small elite of priests and scribes understood the full intricacies of the calendar system and astronomical calculations. This created a situation where the functioning of Maya civilization depended on the continued existence of a small group of specialists who possessed knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. Maya mathematical texts show that they were aware of this vulnerability. Some inscriptions include what appear to be backup calculations, alternative methods for determining important dates in case the primary system failed. Others show evidence of mathematical errors, suggesting that even the most skilled Maya astronomers sometimes made mistakes that could have serious consequences. The Maya had also become dependent on their mathematical system for more than just religious purposes. Their agricultural planning, their military campaigns, their trade relationships, all were organized according to the complex cycles of their calendar system. They had created a civilization that was synchronized to mathematical precision, but this synchronization also made them vulnerable to any disruption in the system. Perhaps most ominously, Maya mathematical texts from the late classic period show increasing concern with endings and catastrophes. They calculated the dates when various cosmic cycles would end and worried about what would happen when these endings occurred. Some texts describe elaborate rituals that would be necessary to ensure the world's survival through these cosmic transitions. The Maya had used mathematics to create a civilization of unprecedented sophistication, but they had also used it to create a prison of their own making. They had become so dependent on mathematical precision and astronomical prediction that any failure of the system could trigger a crisis of confidence that might bring down their entire civilization. The numbers that the Maya calculated with such precision weren't just abstract mathematical concepts. They were the foundation of a worldview that demanded constant validation through ritual sacrifice and astronomical observation. When that validation failed, when the mathematics of the cosmos stopped producing the expected results, the Maya found themselves facing a crisis that no amount of calculation could solve. The mathematics that had lifted them to greatness had also created the conditions for their doom. If you thought Maya mathematics was impressive, wait until you see what they did with warfare. The Maya didn't just fight wars. They turned warfare into a science, an art form, and a religious obligation, all rolled into one terrifyingly efficient package. For over 600 years, Maya cities engaged in conflicts so complex, so brutal, and so sophisticated that they make medieval European warfare look like playground squabbles. Maya warfare wasn't random violence or simple territorial expansion. It was a carefully orchestrated system designed to capture prisoners for sacrifice, demonstrate divine favor, and maintain the cosmic balance that kept the universe functioning. Every battle was planned according to astronomical calculations. Every campaign timed to coincide with favorable celestial events. Every victory celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that turned captured enemies into offerings for the gods. The scale of Maya warfare was staggering. Archaeological evidence shows that some battles involved tens of thousands of warriors fighting across multiple days. The siege of Dos Pilas in 761 CE involved coordinated attacks by multiple allied cities and resulted in the complete destruction of one of the most powerful Maya centers. The conflict between Tikal and Calakmul, which lasted for over a century, drew in dozens of smaller cities and reshaped the political landscape of the entire Maya region. Maya military technology was sophisticated and deadly. They developed specialized weapons that were perfectly adapted to jungle warfare. Obsidian-tipped spears that could penetrate the heaviest armor, atlatls that could launch darts with enough force to kill at 100 meters, and Makua-Wheatle wooden clubs embedded with obsidian blades so sharp they could decapitate a horse with a single blow. Maya warriors wore elaborate costumes that served both practical and psychological purposes. Jaguar pelts and feathered headdresses weren't just decorative. They were designed to intimidate enemies and invoke the power of supernatural beings. Maya war paint wasn't just camouflage. It was a form of magical protection that connected warriors to the gods who governed battle. But the real sophistication of Maya warfare lay in its organization and strategy. Maya armies weren't just collections of individual warriors. They were highly disciplined units with specialized roles and complex command structures. They had scouts who could move through the jungle without leaving traces, engineers who could build siege works and fortifications, and specialists who understood the complex logistics of moving large armies through difficult terrain. Maya military campaigns were planned with the same precision that went into their astronomical observations. Commanders studied enemy cities for months or years before attacking, gathering intelligence about defenses, water supplies, and political alliances. They timed their attacks to coincide with religious festivals, when enemy cities would be distracted by ceremonies, or during the rainy season, when movement would be difficult for defenders. The Maya also developed sophisticated siege tactics that allowed them to capture heavily fortified cities. They built earthworks and palisades to surround enemy settlements, cutting off supplies and forcing defenders into starvation. They diverted water sources and poisoned wells. They used fire arrows to burn thatched roofs and create chaos within enemy cities. But perhaps most importantly, Maya warfare was designed to capture rather than kill. The goal wasn't to destroy enemy armies, but to take prisoners, particularly high-ranking nobles and rulers who could be sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies. A successful Maya military campaign was measured not by the number of enemies killed, but by the prestige of the captives taken. This focus on capture rather than destruction created a form of warfare that was both more and less brutal than what we might expect. Maya battles often ended when one side succeeded in capturing the enemy commander, at which point the defeated army would surrender rather than fight to the death. But the fate of those captured was often worse than death in battle would have been. Captured Maya nobles faced elaborate torture and sacrifice rituals that could last for days or weeks. They might be flayed alive, have their fingernails pulled out, or be subjected to other forms of ritualized torture before finally being killed. The most important captives were reserved for the most elaborate ceremonies, where their deaths would be performed in front of thousands of spectators as offerings to the gods. Maya warfare also had a strong economic component. Successful military campaigns brought not just prisoners for sacrifice, but also tribute payments, trade concessions, and access to valuable resources. Maya cities fought for control of trade routes, obsidian sources, and agricultural land. They raided enemy territories to capture slaves who could be put to work on construction projects or in agricultural fields. The political implications of Maya warfare were equally complex. Military success was seen as proof of divine favor, while defeat could undermine a ruler's legitimacy and lead to rebellion or assassination. Maya kings were expected to personally lead their armies into battle, and many royal inscriptions boast of military victories and the capture of important enemies. But this system of constant warfare also created enormous pressures on Maya society. Cities had to maintain large armies and expensive military equipment. They had to build and maintain fortifications that could protect against increasingly sophisticated siege tactics. They had to develop intelligence networks and diplomatic relationships that could provide warning of enemy attacks. Most importantly, the focus on capturing prisoners for sacrifice created a demand for human victims that could only be satisfied through constant warfare. Maya religious ideology required regular offerings of human blood to maintain cosmic order, and the most valuable sacrifices were enemy nobles captured in battle. This created a vicious cycle where religious needs drove military campaigns, which in turn created the need for more religious ceremonies to celebrate victories and appease the gods. Maya warfare also became increasingly destructive over time. Early conflicts were relatively limited affairs, focused on capturing specific individuals or demonstrating dominance. But by the late Classic period, Maya wars had become total conflicts aimed at the complete destruction of enemy cities. Archaeological evidence shows that many Maya centers were burned and abandoned during this period, their populations scattered or killed. The environmental impact of constant warfare was also significant. Maya armies stripped the countryside of food and resources to supply their campaigns. They cut down forests to build siege works and fortifications. They disrupted agricultural systems and trade networks that had taken centuries to develop. Perhaps most ominously, Maya warfare began to turn inward during the late Classic period. Cities that had been allies for generations turned against each other. Royal families that had intermarried for centuries began plotting each other's destruction. The system of warfare that had once served to maintain political balance and religious order began to tear. Maya civilization, apart from within, the Maya had created a war machine that was incredibly effective at achieving its immediate goals, capturing prisoners, demonstrating divine favor, and maintaining political dominance. But they had also created a system that demanded constant feeding, constant expansion, and constant escalation. Like a fire that consumes everything around it, Maya warfare eventually began to consume the civilization that had created it. The obsidian blades that had once brought victory to Maya armies would eventually be turned against the cities that forged them, and the prisoners who had once been sacrificed to ensure cosmic order would become the last witnesses to a civilization destroying itself through the very violence that had once made it great. To understand why Maya civilization collapsed so completely, you need to understand their gods. And here's the thing about Maya deities. They weren't the benevolent, loving figures you might find in other religions. Maya gods were cosmic forces of terrifying power who demanded constant appeasement, regular feeding, and absolute obedience. They were hungry, violent, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. In fact, they seemed to prefer it. The Maya pantheon was a nightmare menagerie of beings who combined human, animal, and supernatural characteristics in ways that would make Lovecraft weep with envy. There was Chok, the rain god, who appeared as a reptilian creature with fangs and a long, curling nose, demanding blood sacrifices in exchange for the water that kept Maya cities alive. There was Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, a deity of wind and learning who could bring either wisdom or destruction depending on his mood. But perhaps most terrifying was the Maya death god, known by various names but often called Puch or God. A skeletal figure presided over Xibalba, the Maya underworld, a place of torture and suffering where the dead faced trials that made Dante's Inferno look like a pleasant vacation. The death god wasn't just a ruler of the afterlife. He was an active participant in the world of the living, constantly seeking new victims to drag down to his realm. Maya religious texts, particularly the Popol Vuh, describe a universe where gods and humans exist in a state of constant tension and mutual dependence. The gods need human blood and worship to maintain their power, while humans need divine favor to survive in a hostile world. But this wasn't a partnership of equals. The gods held all the cards, and they weren't afraid to use them. According to Maya creation mythology, the current world was actually the fourth attempt by the gods to create suitable humans. The first three attempts had failed because the humans weren't properly grateful or didn't provide adequate worship. The first humans were made of mud and dissolved in the rain. The second were made of wood and were destroyed by a great flood because they had no souls and couldn't properly worship the gods. The third were made of corn but were too perfect and had to be destroyed because they threatened to become equal to the gods themselves. The current humans, also made of corn but deliberately flawed, existed solely to provide worship and sustenance to the gods. This wasn't a metaphor or a spiritual concept. It was literal truth as the Maya understood it. Humans were created as food for the gods, and their primary purpose in life was to provide the blood, incense, and worship that kept the universe functioning. This worldview created a religious system that was both incredibly sophisticated and utterly terrifying. Maya priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were cosmic technicians whose job was to maintain the delicate balance between human and divine worlds through precise ritual performance. Every ceremony had to be performed exactly right, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right offerings, or the consequences could be catastrophic. Maya religious calendar was a complex web of interlocking cycles that determined when specific rituals had to be performed. Some ceremonies occurred daily, others monthly, still others only once every 52 years or longer. The priests who managed this system had to memorize thousands of ritual procedures, astronomical calculations, and mythological narratives. A single mistake could anger the gods and bring disaster to entire cities. The scale of Maya religious observance was staggering. Every major city had dozens of temples, each dedicated to specific deities and used for particular types of ceremonies. The largest temples could accommodate thousands of worshippers and required hundreds of priests to operate properly. The Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, for example, was designed as a massive calendar in stone, with 365 steps representing the days of the year and acoustic properties that amplified the sound of ritual performances. But the real cost of Maya religion wasn't measured in stone and labor, it was measured in blood. Maya religious ideology demanded constant human sacrifice on a scale that's difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Major ceremonies could require hundreds of victims, while smaller daily rituals might only need a few, but the demand was constant, relentless, and non-negotiable. Maya priests developed elaborate taxonomies of sacrifice that specified exactly what type of victim was required for different ceremonies. Children were preferred for rain ceremonies because their tears were believed to encourage the gods to weep and bring rain. Warriors captured in battle were ideal for war god rituals because their courage and strength would transfer to the deity. Virgins were required for certain fertility ceremonies, while elderly victims were preferred for rituals involving wisdom and knowledge. The methods of sacrifice were equally varied and specific. Heart extraction was common, but the Maya also practiced drowning, flaying, shooting with arrows, and ritual strangulation. Some ceremonies required victims to be kept alive for days or weeks while being slowly tortured, their suffering believed to increase the spiritual power of the sacrifice. Maya rulers weren't exempt from these religious demands. In fact, they were expected to participate directly in the most important ceremonies, often subjecting themselves to painful auto-sacrifice rituals that demonstrated their devotion to the gods. Royal blood was considered especially powerful, and Maya kings and queens regularly pierced their tongues, earlobes, and genitals with obsidian blades and stingray spines, collecting the blood on bark paper that was then burned as offerings. But here's where the system became truly dangerous. Maya religious ideology made the gods responsible for everything that happened in the natural world. Droughts, floods, earthquakes, disease outbreaks, military defeats, all were seen as signs of divine displeasure that could only be remedied through increased religious observance and more elaborate sacrifices. This created a vicious cycle where any crisis led to demands for more victims, more ceremonies, and more resources devoted to religious activities. When crops failed, the solution wasn't to develop new agricultural techniques, but to sacrifice more people to the rain god. When enemies attacked, the response wasn't just military but religious, requiring elaborate ceremonies to ensure divine support for the defending army. Maya religious texts from the late classic period show increasing anxiety about the gods' demands and growing difficulty in satisfying them. Inscriptions describe rulers struggling to provide adequate sacrifices, priests warning of divine anger, and communities facing impossible demands for religious observance. Some texts suggest that the gods themselves were becoming more demanding and less satisfied with traditional offerings. The economic burden of Maya religion was also enormous, maintaining the complex temple complexes, supporting the large priestly hierarchies, and providing the constant stream of offerings required by the gods consumed a significant portion of Maya society's resources. Cities had to dedicate vast amounts of labor and materials to religious construction projects, often at the expense of more practical needs like infrastructure maintenance or agricultural development. Perhaps most dangerously, Maya religious ideology made it impossible to question or modify the system when it stopped working. The gods' demands weren't subject to negotiation or rational analysis. They were cosmic laws that had to be obeyed regardless of the cost. When the system began to fail, when the sacrifices stopped producing the desired results, the only acceptable response was to try harder, sacrifice more, and hope that increased devotion would restore divine favor. The Maya had created a religious system that was simultaneously one of humanity's most sophisticated theological achievements and a trap that made rational response to crisis impossible. They had built a civilization around gods who demanded everything and gave nothing in return. And when the crisis came, those same gods would prove utterly incapable of saving the people who had sacrificed everything to serve them. The temples that still rise above the jungle canopy today aren't just monuments to Maya architectural achievement. They're tombstones marking the graves of a civilization that died trying to feed gods who could never be satisfied. By 750 CE, Maya civilization had reached heights that should have guaranteed its survival for millennia. Their cities housed millions of people, Their trade networks stretched across Mesoamerica. Their scientific achievements surpassed anything the contemporary world could offer. They had solved the impossible puzzle of building a sophisticated civilization in the tropical rainforest. They should have been unstoppable. Instead, they were about to discover that success itself could be the most dangerous enemy of all. The first cracks in Maya paradise weren't dramatic. They were subtle, almost invisible signs that the incredible system they had built was beginning to strain under its own weight. Population growth, which had been the engine of Maya expansion for centuries, was starting to push against the limits of what even their sophisticated agricultural techniques could support. Cities that had grown steadily for generations were suddenly finding it difficult to feed their inhabitants. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of increasing desperation disguised as continued prosperity. Maya rulers were commissioning ever more elaborate construction projects, building bigger pyramids, more complex palaces, and increasingly ornate monuments. But beneath this facade of continued growth, the foundations of Maya society were beginning to crumble. The agricultural system that had supported Maya civilization for over 1,000 years was showing signs of serious stress. Soil samples from Maya agricultural areas reveal increasing erosion and nutrient depletion during the late Classic period. The intensive farming techniques that had allowed the Maya to support unprecedented population densities were literally wearing out the land that sustained them. Maya farmers had pushed their agricultural system to its absolute limits. They had terraced every available hillside, drained every swamp that could be converted to farmland, and intensified their cultivation to the point where the soil was beginning to fail. The milpa system, which had worked so well for centuries, required periodic fallowing to restore soil fertility, but population pressure was forcing farmers to reduce fallow periods or eliminate them entirely. The consequences were predictable but apparently invisible to Maya planners. Crop yields began to decline just as population was reaching its peak. Cities that had grown accustomed to agricultural surpluses suddenly found themselves struggling to meet basic food needs. The sophisticated trade networks that had distributed resources across the Maya world began to strain as communities hoarded food and other essential supplies. Water management, another pillar of Maya civilization, was also beginning to fail. The elaborate reservoir systems that had allowed Maya cities to survive the dry season were showing signs of serious problems. Siltation was reducing storage capacity, while increasing demand was draining reserves faster than they could be replenished. Some cities were forced to implement water rationing for the first time in their history. The political system that had managed Maya civilization for centuries was also showing signs of stress. The constant warfare that had once served to maintain balance between competing cities was becoming increasingly destructive. Instead of the ritualized conflicts that had characterized earlier periods, Maya wars were becoming total conflicts aimed at the complete destruction of enemy cities. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic increase in fortifications around Maya cities. Settlements that had existed for centuries without defensive walls suddenly found themselves building elaborate fortification systems. Trade routes that had operated safely for generations became dangerous as warfare intensified and banditry increased. The religious system that had provided ideological unity for Maya civilization was also beginning to show cracks. Inscriptions from the late Classic period reveal increasing anxiety about the gods' favor and growing difficulty in performing the elaborate ceremonies that Maya religion required. Some texts suggest that traditional rituals were failing to produce the expected results, leading to demands for even more elaborate and costly ceremonies. Maya rulers were caught in an impossible bind. Their legitimacy depended on their ability to maintain prosperity and divine favor through proper ritual performance. But the very ceremonies that validated their authority were consuming increasing amounts of resources that their struggling economies could barely afford. The more problems their cities faced, the more elaborate the religious responses became, creating a vicious cycle that drained resources from practical solutions. The intellectual achievements that had once been Maya civilization's greatest strength were also becoming liabilities. The complex calendar system that had allowed them to coordinate activities across vast distances was becoming a straitjacket that prevented flexible responses to changing conditions. The astronomical observations that had once demonstrated divine favor were increasingly predicting disasters that Maya rulers were powerless to prevent. Maya scribes from this period produced texts that reveal a civilization increasingly obsessed with endings and catastrophes. They calculated the dates when various cosmic cycles would conclude and worried about what would happen when these endings occurred. Some inscriptions describe elaborate rituals that would be necessary to ensure the world's survival through cosmic transitions. Rituals that required resources and sacrifices on a scale that was becoming impossible to sustain. The trade networks that had once been a source of Maya strength were also becoming vulnerabilities. Cities that had grown dependent on imported goods found themselves vulnerable when trade routes were disrupted by warfare or political instability. The specialization that had made Maya civilization so efficient also made it fragile, as communities that had focused on producing specific goods for trade found themselves unable to meet their own basic needs when trade networks failed. Environmental problems were also mounting. Deforestation around major Maya cities was reaching critical levels as growing populations demanded more farmland and construction materials. The careful balance between human needs and environmental sustainability that had characterized earlier Maya development was breaking down under the pressure of continued growth. Climate data from this period suggests that the Maya were also facing increasing environmental stress from natural causes. Tree ring data and lake sediment cores indicate that the late Classic period was characterized by increasing climatic instability, with more frequent droughts and more severe wet seasons. The agricultural system that had been designed to handle normal climatic variation was struggling to cope with increasingly extreme conditions. Perhaps, most ominously, the social cohesion that had held Maya civilization together was beginning to fracture. Archaeological evidence suggests increasing inequality during the late Classic period, with elite districts becoming more elaborate, while common residential areas showed signs of declining living standards. The shared ideology that had united Maya society was giving way to increasing tension between rulers and ruled. Maya cities that had cooperated for centuries were turning against each other with increasing frequency. Alliances that had lasted for generations were dissolving as communities competed for dwindling resources. The political stability that had allowed Maya civilization to flourish was giving way to chaos and conflict. The Maya had built a civilization that was simultaneously one of humanity's greatest achievements and a house of cards waiting for the right disturbance to bring it all crashing down. They had created systems so complex and interdependent that any significant disruption could cascade into total collapse. They had pushed their environment, their political system, and their social structure to the absolute limits of what was sustainable. The cracks in paradise were spreading, and the Maya seemed powerless to stop them. The very sophistication that had lifted them to greatness was now working against them, creating a civilization so complex that it had become impossible to manage. The stage was set for one of history's most spectacular collapses, and the Maya, for all their mathematical precision and astronomical knowledge, apparently never saw it coming. The paradise they had built in the jungle was about to become a tomb, and the gods they had served so faithfully were about to abandon them to face the consequences of their own success. Around 820 CE, something happened that would make the Maya question everything they thought they knew about their relationship with the gods. The rains, which had fallen with predictable regularity for over 1,000 years, simply stopped. Not gradually, not with the gentle decline you might expect from a changing climate, but with the brutal finality of a cosmic switch being flipped to the off position. This wasn't just a bad year or even a series of bad years. Paleoclimatic evidence from lake sediments, tree rings, and cave formations tells the story of a drought so severe and prolonged that it redefined what was possible in the Maya world. For nearly 2 centuries, from roughly 820 to 1000 CE, the Maya lowlands experienced the most severe drought in over 7,000 years of regional climate history. To understand what this meant for Maya civilization, you need to understand just how completely they had adapted their entire way of life to the rhythms of tropical rainfall. Maya cities weren't just built in the rainforest. They were designed around the assumption that the rains would come every year with clockwork precision. Their massive reservoir systems, their agricultural cycles, their religious ceremonies, even their political calendar, all were synchronized to the annual rhythm of wet and dry seasons. The Maya had become so successful at managing water that they had forgotten how precarious their situation really was. Their cities housed hundreds of thousands of people in a region where surface water was naturally scarce. They had built urban centers that required millions of gallons of water daily in an environment where every drop had to be carefully collected and stored during the brief rainy season. When the rains failed, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The massive reservoirs that had seemed like permanent features of the landscape began to shrink, then dry up entirely. Springs that had flowed for centuries went dry. The cenotes, the sacred wells that provided both water and access to the underworld, dropped to levels that made them unusable. Maya engineers, who had spent centuries perfecting techniques for managing too much water, suddenly found themselves facing the opposite problem. They tried desperately to adapt their systems, digging deeper wells, building longer aqueducts, and implementing strict water rationing. But their cities had grown too large, and their populations too dense for the reduced water supplies to sustain. The agricultural impact was even more devastating. Maya farming techniques, sophisticated as they were, depended entirely on seasonal rainfall. The milpa system that had fed millions of people for over a millennium simply stopped working when the rains failed to come. Crops withered in the fields, stored grain reserves were quickly exhausted, and famine began to stalk the great cities of the Maya world. Maya farmers tried everything they could think of to adapt to the new conditions. They attempted to dig irrigation canals to bring water from distant sources, but the engineering challenges were enormous, and the water sources themselves were drying up. They tried switching to more drought-resistant crops, but these produced lower yields and couldn't support the massive populations that Maya cities had accumulated. The social and political consequences of the drought were equally severe. Maya rulers derived their legitimacy from their ability to maintain prosperity and ensure divine favor through proper ritual performance. When the rains stopped coming despite increasingly elaborate ceremonies and ever more costly sacrifices, people began to question whether their rulers really had the divine connections they claimed. Maya religious ideology, which had served as the foundation of their civilization for over 1,000 years, suddenly became a liability. The gods who were supposed to control the rains were apparently ignoring even the most desperate appeals. The astronomical calculations that had once seemed to demonstrate divine favor were now predicting disasters that the rulers were powerless to prevent. The response of Maya religious authorities to the crisis reveals both their desperation and their inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Instead of questioning the system that was clearly failing, they doubled down on traditional approaches. Sacrificial ceremonies became more frequent and more elaborate. Rulers subjected themselves to increasingly severe auto-sacrifice rituals. Some cities apparently sacrificed their entire populations of captives in desperate attempts to appease the rain gods. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a civilization in the grip of religious hysteria. New temples were built even as cities were running out of water. Elaborate ceremonies were performed even as people were starving. The resources that might have been used to develop new water sources or alternative food production methods were instead devoted to increasingly desperate attempts to restore divine favor through traditional means. The political fragmentation that had been building during the late Classic period accelerated dramatically during the drought. Cities that had been allies for centuries turned against each other in competition for dwindling water and food resources. Trade networks that had operated for generations collapsed as communities hoarded whatever resources they could find. Maya warfare, which had once been a ritualized activity focused on capturing prisoners for sacrifice, became a desperate struggle for survival. Cities fought not for prestige or divine favor, but for access to the few remaining water sources and productive agricultural areas. The elaborate rules and customs that had governed Maya warfare for centuries were abandoned as communities faced the choice between conquest and extinction. The demographic impact of the drought was staggering. Population estimates suggest that the Maya lowlands lost between 80 and 90% of their population during the collapse period. Some cities were completely abandoned, their inhabitants either dead from starvation and disease or scattered to regions where water was still available. But perhaps most tragically, the Maya had the knowledge and technology to potentially survive the drought if they had been able to adapt their systems quickly enough. They understood hydraulic engineering, they had experience with water management, and they had the organizational capacity to coordinate large-scale public works projects. What they lacked was the institutional flexibility to abandon the systems that had made them successful and try something completely different. Maya civilization had become a victim of its own success. They had created systems so sophisticated and so perfectly adapted to their environment that they couldn't change when that environment changed. The religious ideology that had motivated their greatest achievements also prevented them from questioning those achievements when they stopped working. The drought that destroyed Maya civilization wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a test of adaptability that they failed catastrophically. They had built a civilization that could thrive in the rainforest, but couldn't survive when the rainforest temporarily stopped being a rainforest. They had created a culture so dependent on the predictable rhythms of tropical climate that they couldn't function when those rhythms were disrupted. The irony is that the drought eventually ended. The rains returned, the forests recovered, and the environment that had supported Maya civilization for over 1,000 years was restored. But by then, it was too late. The cities were empty, the knowledge was lost, and the civilization that had once seemed destined to last forever had vanished into the jungle that had given it birth. The Maya had learned to read the stars and predict eclipses centuries in advance, but they couldn't see the drought that would destroy them coming until it was too late to do anything about it. They had mastered the mathematics of time and space, but they couldn't calculate their way out of a crisis that required not more knowledge, but the wisdom to abandon everything they thought they knew and start over. When the rain stopped coming, the Maya discovered that all their sophistication, all their achievements, all their divine connections were ultimately powerless against the simple fact that civilizations, like people, need water to survive. And when that water disappeared, so did they. When the rains stopped, the Maya discovered something that their mathematical precision and astronomical knowledge had never prepared them for. Hunger doesn't care about your achievements. Famine is the great equalizer, the force that reduces kings to beggars and turns the most sophisticated civilization into a desperate struggle for survival. And the famine that struck the Maya world during the Great Drought wasn't just a temporary hardship. It was a civilizational apocalypse that would consume everything they had built. The Maya had always lived closer to the edge of subsistence than their magnificent cities suggested. Despite their agricultural innovations and sophisticated farming techniques, they had pushed their food production system to its absolute limits to support the massive populations that their cities had accumulated. When the drought struck, that delicate balance collapsed with terrifying speed. Maya agricultural records from the early stages of the drought show administrators desperately trying to maintain normal food distribution systems. Even as crop yields plummeted, granaries that had once overflowed with surplus corn were emptied within months. The elaborate trade networks that had distributed food across the Maya world began to break down as communities hoarded whatever supplies they could find. The social hierarchy that had defined Maya civilization for centuries began to crumble under the pressure of hunger. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that even elite residential areas began to show signs of nutritional stress. Skeletal remains from noble burials reveal the telltale signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, dental problems, and bone diseases that indicate prolonged periods of inadequate nutrition. But it was among the common people that the famine struck with the most devastating force. Maya commoners, who had always lived on the margins of subsistence, were the first to feel the effects of crop failures. Skeletal evidence from common residential areas shows mortality rates that spiked dramatically during the drought period, with children and elderly people dying in numbers that suggest widespread starvation. The Maya response to famine reveals both their desperation and their inability to break free from the ideological constraints that had shaped their civilization. Instead of abandoning the massive ceremonial centers that consumed enormous amounts of resources, Maya rulers continued to commission elaborate construction projects, even as their people starved. Instead of redistributing food from elite stores to feed the hungry, they increased the scale of sacrificial ceremonies in desperate attempts to restore divine favor. Maya religious texts from this period show a civilization caught in a death spiral of its own making. The gods who were supposed to provide food and prosperity were apparently ignoring even the most desperate appeals. The response wasn't to question the system, but to intensify it, leading to sacrificial ceremonies on a scale that defies comprehension. Some archaeological sites from this period show evidence of mass sacrifices involving hundreds or even thousands of victims. The Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza contains deposits of human bones that suggest entire populations were sacrificed in desperate attempts to end the famine. The irony is staggering. The Maya were killing the very people they needed to rebuild their agricultural system in order to appease gods who had apparently already abandoned them. The famine also triggered social upheavals that shattered the political order that had governed Maya civilization for centuries. Hungry people don't respect divine kingship, and starving populations don't care about astronomical calculations or religious ceremonies. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Maya cities experienced violent uprisings during this period, with palaces burned and elite residential areas destroyed by angry mobs. Maya rulers found themselves caught between impossible demands. Their religious ideology required them to maintain elaborate ceremonies and costly sacrificial rituals to ensure divine favor. But their starving populations demanded practical solutions: food, water, and relief from the suffering that was consuming their cities. The rulers who tried to maintain traditional religious observances were overthrown by desperate populations. Those who tried to focus on practical solutions were condemned by priests as impious and faced religious rebellions. The breakdown of central authority led to the fragmentation of Maya political systems. Cities that had been united under powerful rulers for centuries split into competing factions. Trade networks that had operated under the protection of stable governments collapsed as banditry and warfare made commerce impossible. The specialization that had made Maya civilization so efficient became a liability as communities that had focused on producing specific goods for trade found themselves unable to meet their own basic food needs. Maya warfare during the famine period took on a character that was completely different from the ritualized conflicts of earlier eras. Instead of fighting for prestige or prisoners for sacrifice, Maya armies were now fighting for survival. Cities raided each other's remaining food stores, fought for control of the few productive agricultural areas that remained, and competed for access to water sources. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of increasing desperation and violence. Fortifications around Maya cities became more elaborate and extensive as communities tried to protect their dwindling resources from increasingly desperate neighbors. Massed graves containing the remains of violence victims become common in the archaeological record, suggesting that warfare had become a constant feature of Maya life. But perhaps most tragically, the famine destroyed the knowledge systems that had made Maya civilization possible in the first place. The scribes who maintained the complex calendar systems and astronomical observations were among the first casualties of social breakdown. The priests who preserved religious knowledge and ritual procedures died or fled as temples were abandoned. The craftsmen who had created Maya art and architecture scattered as the economic systems that supported them collapsed. Maya libraries, which had contained centuries of accumulated knowledge about everything from astronomy to medicine to agricultural techniques, were destroyed or abandoned. The bark paper books that had preserved Maya learning for generations rotted in abandoned temples or were burned for fuel by desperate survivors. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate was lost in a matter of decades. The demographic collapse that accompanied the famine was so severe that entire regions were completely depopulated. Cities that had housed hundreds of thousands of people were reduced to ghost towns inhabited only by scavengers picking through the ruins. The population density that had once been Maya civilization's greatest achievement became its greatest vulnerability as concentrated populations proved impossible to feed when agricultural systems failed. Some Maya communities tried to adapt by returning to simpler, more sustainable ways of life. They abandoned the great cities and returned to small-scale farming communities that could survive on local resources. But even these adaptations often failed as the environmental damage caused by centuries of intensive agriculture made it difficult to restore productive farming systems. The famine that destroyed Maya civilization wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a revelation of the fundamental unsustainability of the system they had created. They had built a civilization that could thrive in times of abundance, but couldn't survive when abundance turned to scarcity. They had created a society so complex and specialized that it couldn't adapt when the basic assumptions that underlay its existence were proven false. The hunger that devoured Maya cities wasn't just physical hunger for food. It was a civilizational hunger for resources, for growth, for ever greater achievements that had pushed their society beyond the limits of what their environment could sustain. When the rain stopped and the crops failed, that hunger turned inward and consumed the very civilization that had created it. The Maya had learned to build pyramids that touched the sky, but they had never learned to build a society that could survive when the sky stopped providing the rain that made their achievements possible. In the end, all their sophistication, all their knowledge, all their divine connections, proved powerless against the simple biological fact that people need food to live. And when that food disappears, so do the people who depend on it. If drought was the first horseman of the Maya apocalypse and famine was the second, then disease was the third, and it rode through the weakened cities like a scythe through wheat. When populations are already stressed by malnutrition and social breakdown, they become perfect breeding grounds for the kinds of epidemics that can finish what drought and hunger started. The Maya, weakened by years of starvation and social chaos, were about to discover that their sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics was utterly useless against microscopic enemies they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't fight. The relationship between famine and disease is one of history's most reliable partnerships. Malnourished populations have compromised immune systems that make them vulnerable to infections that well-fed people might easily survive. Overcrowded conditions, poor sanitation, and social breakdown create perfect conditions for the rapid spread of infectious diseases. The Maya, who had managed to support unprecedented population densities in their urban centers, had unknowingly created ideal conditions for epidemic disease. Archaeological evidence from Maya sites during the collapse period tells a grim story of populations under biological siege. Skeletal remains show not just the effects of malnutrition, but also the telltale signs of infectious disease. Bone lesions that suggest tuberculosis, dental problems that indicate chronic illness, and mortality patterns that point to epidemic outbreaks that killed people of all ages. The Maya had always lived with endemic diseases, of course. Tropical environments are notorious for harboring pathogens that can cause serious illness in human populations, but their sophisticated urban planning and water management systems had generally allowed them to control disease outbreaks and maintain healthy populations. When those systems broke down during the drought and famine, the diseases that had always lurked in the background suddenly exploded into full-scale epidemics. Waterborne diseases were probably among the first to strike, as the elaborate reservoir systems that had provided clean water to Maya cities dried up or became contaminated. Populations were forced to use whatever water sources they could find. Stagnant pools, contaminated wells, and shared water containers became vectors for diseases like cholera and dysentery that could kill within days of infection. The Maya understanding of disease was sophisticated in some ways, but fatally flawed in others. They had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants and could perform complex surgical procedures. Maya medical texts describe treatments for everything from broken bones to mental illness, but their disease theory was based on supernatural rather than biological causation. They believed the illness was caused by divine displeasure, supernatural attack, or imbalances in cosmic forces. This supernatural understanding of disease led to responses that often made epidemics worse rather than better. Instead of implementing quarantine measures or improving sanitation, Maya communities responded to disease outbreaks with elaborate religious ceremonies designed to appease angry gods or drive away supernatural enemies. These ceremonies often involved large gatherings of people that provided perfect opportunities for diseases to spread. Maya medical practitioners, known as Amen, were skilled healers who combined practical medical knowledge with religious ritual. But when faced with epidemic diseases that didn't respond to traditional treatments, they often concluded that the illnesses were caused by particularly powerful supernatural forces that required more extreme religious responses. This led to increasingly desperate ceremonies that consumed resources and energy that might have been better used for practical disease control measures. The social breakdown that accompanied the drought and famine also created conditions that made disease control impossible. The administrative systems that had managed public health in Maya cities collapsed as governments fell and populations scattered. The trade networks that had distributed medicinal plants and other medical supplies were disrupted by warfare and social chaos. The specialists who had provided medical care fled or died as the economic systems that supported them disintegrated. Perhaps most tragically, the diseases that struck Maya populations during the collapse period may have included new pathogens introduced through contact with other regions. The trade networks that had been one of Maya civilization's greatest strengths also made them vulnerable to diseases from distant areas. As social breakdown forced populations to migrate and seek resources in new areas, they may have encountered diseases to which they had no immunity. The demographic impact of epidemic disease during the Maya collapse was catastrophic. Populations that had already been weakened by drought and famine were devastated by disease outbreaks that could kill 30, 40, or even 50% of a community within months. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable, but diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia could kill healthy adults as well. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Maya cities were completely depopulated by disease outbreaks. Mass burial sites from this period contain the remains of hundreds of people who died within short time periods, suggesting epidemic diseases that overwhelmed the ability of survivors to properly dispose of the dead. In some cases, bodies were simply abandoned in houses and temples, left to decompose as survivors fled in terror. The psychological impact of epidemic disease was almost as devastating as the physical impact. Maya populations that had believed their rulers could control cosmic forces through proper ritual performance suddenly found themselves facing invisible enemies that no amount of ceremony could defeat. The religious worldview that had provided meaning and structure to Maya life for centuries was shattered by the reality of diseases that killed the pious and impious alike. Maya responses to epidemic disease reveal a civilization in the grip of supernatural terror. Some communities concluded that the diseases were punishment for inadequate religious observance and responded with even more elaborate sacrificial ceremonies. Others decided that their traditional gods had abandoned them and turned to new religious practices or foreign deities. Still others simply gave up on organized religion entirely and focused on immediate survival. The breakdown of medical knowledge and practice during the collapse period was particularly tragic. Maya medical practitioners had accumulated centuries of knowledge about treating diseases and maintaining public health, but this knowledge was largely transmitted orally or recorded in books that were destroyed during the social chaos of the collapse period. Medical specialists who died during epidemics took their knowledge with them, leaving survivors without the expertise needed to deal with continuing health crises. The diseases that helped destroy Maya civilization didn't just kill people, they destroyed the social bonds and cultural knowledge that had made Maya society possible. Communities that had cooperated for centuries turned against each other, as disease outbreaks were blamed on supernatural attacks by enemy groups. Families abandoned sick relatives to prevent the spread of infection. Religious and political leaders lost credibility as their promises of divine protection proved worthless against epidemic disease. The Maya had built a civilization that was remarkably successful at managing many of the challenges of tropical life, but they had never developed effective responses to the kinds of epidemic diseases that could emerge when their carefully balanced systems broke down. Their sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics was useless against pathogens that followed biological rather than cosmic laws. Disease was the final blow that finished what drought and famine had started. It swept through the weakened remnants of Maya civilization like wildfire, consuming the last vestiges of the urban centers that had once been among humanity's greatest achievements. When the epidemics finally burned themselves out, they left behind empty cities and scattered survivors who no longer had the knowledge or resources to rebuild what had been lost. The Maya had learned to predict eclipses and calculate the movements of planets, but they couldn't predict or control the microscopic enemies that would help bring their civilization to an end. In the face of epidemic disease, all their sophistication proved as fragile as the human bodies that disease consumed with such terrifying efficiency. In the final decades of Maya civilization, as cities emptied and knowledge systems collapsed, a handful of rulers clung to power in the crumbling remnants of what had once been the greatest civilization in the Americas. These last kings of the Maya world were tragic figures, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of divine authority, while their kingdoms literally crumbled around them. Their inscriptions, carved in stone, even as their cities died, provide a haunting glimpse into the psychology of civilizational collapse. The last dated Maya inscription was carved at Tanina in 909 CE, marking the end of over 600 years of continuous historical record-keeping. But this wasn't a sudden stop. It was the final gasp of a tradition that had been dying for decades. The inscriptions from the late classic period tell a story of rulers who were increasingly desperate, increasingly isolated, and increasingly delusional about their ability to restore the glory that was slipping away. These final Maya rulers faced challenges that would have broken lesser civilizations centuries earlier. Their cities were depopulating as people fled to find food and water elsewhere. Their trade networks had collapsed, cutting off access to the luxury goods and exotic materials that had once demonstrated their divine connections. Their agricultural systems had failed, leaving them unable to feed even the reduced populations that remained. Yet they continued to commission elaborate monuments and perform costly ceremonies as if nothing had changed. The psychology revealed in these late inscriptions is fascinating and terrifying. Maya rulers had been raised from birth to believe that they were living gods whose ritual performances maintained cosmic order. When that cosmic order began to collapse, they didn't question their beliefs or adapt their practices. Instead, they doubled down on traditional approaches, commissioning ever more elaborate ceremonies and increasingly desperate appeals to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. Some of the most poignant inscriptions from this period describe rulers performing auto-sacrifice rituals of unprecedented severity. Kings who had once pierced their tongues with stingray spines were now mutilating themselves in ways that would have been considered extreme even by Maya standards. Queens subjected themselves to tortures that left them permanently disabled, all in desperate attempts to restore divine favor through increased suffering. The architectural projects commissioned by these last rulers reveal a civilization that had lost touch with reality, even as their cities were running out of water and their people were starving. Maya kings continued to build massive pyramids and elaborate palaces. The resources that might have been used to develop new water sources or alternative food production methods were instead devoted to monuments that would never be completed. Some of these final construction projects were never finished, their half-built pyramids and incomplete palaces standing today as monuments to the delusion and desperation of rulers who couldn't accept that their world was ending. Others were completed but never used, elaborate ceremonial centers built for populations that had already fled or died. The political fragmentation that characterized the final decades of Maya civilization created a situation where dozens of petty rulers were competing for control of increasingly worthless territories. Cities that had once commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of people were reduced to controlling a few square kilometers of depopulated countryside. Yet their rulers continued to use the same grandiose titles and perform the same elaborate ceremonies as if they still commanded vast empires. Maya warfare during this period took on an almost surreal quality. Armies that numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands fought over cities that were already empty. Rulers captured enemies who commanded no real resources and performed victory ceremonies for audiences that barely existed. The elaborate rules and customs that had governed Maya warfare for centuries were maintained even when they no longer served any practical purpose. The religious responses of these final rulers reveal a civilization in the grip of supernatural terror. Some concluded that traditional ceremonies were inadequate and began experimenting with new forms of sacrifice that were even more extreme than anything that had come before. Others decided that their traditional gods had abandoned them and began importing religious practices from other regions or inventing entirely new forms of worship. Archaeological evidence from this period shows religious practices that had become completely divorced from practical reality. Temples were built and elaborate ceremonies performed even in cities where the population had dropped to a few hundred people. Massive sacrificial offerings were made even when communities could barely feed themselves. The resources that might have been used for survival were instead devoted to increasingly desperate attempts to restore divine favor. The knowledge systems that had been Maya civilization's greatest achievement were also collapsing during this period. The scribes who maintained the complex calendar systems and astronomical observations were among the first casualties of social breakdown. The libraries that had preserved centuries of accumulated learning were abandoned or destroyed. The schools where young nobles had learned to read and write were closed as the economic systems that supported them disintegrated. Some of the last Maya rulers seemed to have been aware that they were witnessing the end of their civilization. Their inscriptions include references to cosmic cycles ending and new ages beginning. Some texts describe elaborate rituals that would be necessary to ensure the world's survival through cosmic transitions. Others seem to accept that the current world was ending and focus on ensuring that the rulers' names would be remembered in whatever came next. The isolation of these final rulers was almost complete. The trade networks that had once connected Maya cities across hundreds of kilometers had collapsed, leaving individual rulers cut off from news of what was happening elsewhere. Some may have believed that they were the only survivors of a cosmic catastrophe that had destroyed the rest of the Maya world. Others may have continued their elaborate ceremonies in the hope that other cities were doing the same and that collective ritual performance might still restore cosmic order. The end, when it came, was often pathetically anticlimactic. Cities that had been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years were simply abandoned, their last inhabitants walking away from monuments that had taken generations to build. Palaces that had housed divine kings were left to the jungle, their elaborate decorations slowly disappearing under vines and roots. Some rulers may have died alone in their empty palaces, still performing the daily rituals that they believed maintained cosmic order. Others may have fled with the last of their followers, carrying sacred objects and ritual knowledge that would die with them in the jungle. A few may have successfully transitioned to simpler ways of life, abandoning their divine pretensions and learning to survive as ordinary people in a world that no longer had room for god kings. The last kings of the Maya world were tragic figures who embodied both the greatest achievements and the ultimate failure of their civilization. They had been raised to believe that they were cosmic forces whose actions maintained the balance of the universe. When that universe collapsed around them, they discovered that all their divine authority, all their ritual knowledge, all their astronomical wisdom was powerless against the simple reality that civilizations, like people, can die. Their monuments still stand in the jungle today, half-finished pyramids and empty palaces that serve as tombstones for a civilization that died believing it was immortal. The inscriptions they left behind are the final words of a world that had forgotten how to adapt, how to change, how to survive when the old ways stopped working. The last kings of the Maya ruled over kingdoms of ghosts, performing ceremonies for gods who had already abandoned them, maintaining traditions that no longer had any meaning in a world that had moved beyond their understanding. They were the final act in a tragedy that had been building for centuries, the last desperate attempt to maintain order in a cosmos that had already chosen chaos. There's something uniquely terrifying about the silence that followed the collapse of Maya civilization. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest, but the unnatural hush of places where human voices should be heard but aren't. By 950 CE, cities that had echoed with the sounds of hundreds of thousands of people for over a millennium had fallen silent. The marketplaces where merchants had haggled over jade and obsidian were empty. The ball courts where crowds had cheered ritual games were overgrown with weeds. The temples where priests had chanted daily prayers to maintain cosmic order stood abandoned, their altars cold and their sacred fires extinguished. This wasn't the gradual decline you might expect from a dying civilization. Maya cities didn't slowly shrink over generations as people drifted away to better opportunities elsewhere. They were abandoned suddenly, completely, and apparently without any plan for return. Archaeological evidence shows that people simply walked away from their homes, leaving behind pottery, tools, and personal possessions as if they expected to come back in a few days. But they never did. The speed of the abandonment is one of the most puzzling aspects of the Maya collapse. Cities that had been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years were emptied within a few decades. Tikal, which had housed over 100,000 people at its peak, was reduced to a few hundred inhabitants by 900 CE and was completely abandoned shortly thereafter. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, suffered a similar fate. El Mirador, with its massive pyramids that had dominated the landscape for centuries, was swallowed by the jungle so completely that it wasn't rediscovered until the 20th century. The silence that descended on these cities wasn't just the absence of human voices, it was the death of entire knowledge systems that had taken centuries to develop. The Maya had created one of the world's most sophisticated writing systems, capable of recording everything from historical chronicles to mathematical treatises to epic poetry. But when the cities were abandoned, the scribes who could read and write these texts disappeared with them. Maya libraries, which had contained thousands of bark paper books covering every aspect of their civilization, were left to rot in abandoned temples. The humid tropical climate that had challenged Maya builders for centuries now worked to destroy their intellectual achievements. Books that had survived for hundreds of years crumbled to dust within decades of being abandoned. Knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate was lost forever. The astronomical observations that had been Maya civilization's greatest scientific achievement simply stopped. Observatories that had tracked the movements of planets for centuries fell silent. The complex calculations that had allowed Maya astronomers to predict eclipses and planetary conjunctions were abandoned. The calendar systems that had coordinated activities across the Maya world were forgotten. Perhaps most tragically, the oral traditions that had preserved Maya mythology, history, and cultural knowledge were broken when the communities that maintained them dispersed. Stories that had been passed down from generation to generation for over 1,000 years died with the last storytellers. Songs that had celebrated Maya achievements and preserved their collective memory were silenced forever. The silence wasn't just cultural, it was also technological. Maya craftsmen had developed sophisticated techniques for working jade, obsidian, and other materials that required generations of training to master. When the workshops were abandoned and the master craftsmen scattered, these techniques were lost. The knowledge of how to build the massive pyramids and complex water management systems that had made Maya civilization possible disappeared with the engineers who had created them. The agricultural knowledge that had allowed the Maya to support unprecedented population densities in the tropical rainforest was also lost. The careful understanding of soil management, crop rotation, and water conservation that had taken centuries to develop was forgotten when the farmers who possessed it abandoned their fields. The milpa system that had sustained millions of people for over a millennium was reduced to a few scattered practitioners who lacked the institutional support to maintain its full complexity. The political systems that had governed Maya civilization for centuries simply evaporated. The complex networks of alliances and obligations that had connected dozens of city-states across hundreds of kilometers were severed when the cities themselves were abandoned. The diplomatic protocols and legal traditions that had managed intercity relationships were forgotten. The administrative systems that had coordinated trade, taxation, and public works projects disappeared. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Maya silence was its completeness. Other civilizations that have collapsed have left behind successor states, refugee populations, or at least oral traditions that preserved some memory of what had been lost. The Maya seemed to vanish so completely that even their neighbors lost track of what had happened to them. Spanish conquistadors arriving in the Yucatan in the 16th century found scattered Maya, communities that had no memory of the great cities that lay hidden in the jungle just a few kilometers away. The descendants of the people who had built Tikal and Calakmul had no idea that their ancestors had created one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. The knowledge of how to read Maya hieroglyphs was so completely lost that it took modern scholars over a century to begin deciphering them. The jungle that had been held back by Maya farmers and engineers for over a millennium quickly reclaimed the abandoned cities. Roots cracked apart the carefully fitted stones of pyramid walls. Vines pulled down the elaborate facades of palaces. Trees grew through the roofs of temples, their branches reaching toward the sky, where Maya priests had once made observations of the stars. The water management systems that had been Maya engineering's greatest achievement were among the first casualties of abandonment. Without constant maintenance, the elaborate networks of canals, reservoirs, and drainage systems quickly failed. Dams broke, channels silted up, and the carefully controlled flow of water that had sustained Maya cities became wild streams that carved new paths through the ruins. The silence that swallowed Maya cities was so complete that it took on an almost supernatural quality. Early explorers who stumbled upon the ruins in the 19th century described an eerie feeling of being watched by invisible presences. The empty doorways and vacant windows of abandoned palaces seemed to stare back at visitors with the hollow gaze of the dead. Modern archaeologists working in Maya ruins often report similar feelings. There's something unsettling about excavating cities where the normal archaeological sequence of gradual change and cultural continuity is replaced by sudden, complete abandonment. The artifacts that emerge from Maya sites tell stories that end in mid-sentence, lives that were interrupted rather than concluded. The silence that followed the Maya collapse wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of meaning. The elaborate symbolic systems that had given structure and purpose to Maya life were abandoned along with the cities themselves. The cosmic order that Maya rulers had claimed to maintain through their ritual performances was revealed to be as fragile as the human voices that had proclaimed it. Today, the ruins of Maya cities stand as monuments to the power of silence, to erase even the greatest human achievements. The pyramids, that once echoed with the chants of priests, now host only the calls of howler monkeys. The palaces, where kings once held court, are inhabited only by bats and spiders. The ball courts, where crowds once cheered ritual games, are silent except for the whisper of wind through empty stone rings. The silence that swallowed Maya cities is a reminder of how quickly and completely human achievements can disappear. Civilizations that seem permanent and unshakable can vanish so thoroughly that even their memory is lost. The voices that once filled Maya cities with life and meaning have been silent for over 1,000 years. And in that silence lies one of history's most profound and unsettling lessons about the fragility of everything we build and everything we believe will last forever. Standing in the ruins of Tikal today, surrounded by pyramids that pierce the jungle canopy like stone fingers reaching toward indifferent gods, you're confronted with one of archaeology's most maddening puzzles. How do you explain the complete collapse of one of humanity's most sophisticated civilizations? For over a century, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians have proposed theories ranging from the plausible to the bizarre, from the scientifically rigorous to the wildly speculative. The problem is that the Maya collapse was so complete, so sudden, and so thorough that almost any explanation seems both possible and inadequate. The drought theory, which we've already explored, has the strongest scientific support. Paleoclimatic evidence from lake sediments, cave formations, and tree rings clearly shows that the Maya lowlands experienced severe drought conditions during the collapse period. The correlation between climate data and archaeological evidence of abandonment is compelling. But correlation isn't causation, and many archaeologists argue that drought alone can't explain why a civilization that had survived previous dry periods for over 1,000 years would suddenly collapse so completely. The environmental degradation theory suggests that the Maya destroyed their own environment through unsustainable agricultural practices. Soil samples from Maya agricultural areas show evidence of erosion and nutrient depletion during the late Classic period. Pollen analysis indicates massive deforestation around major cities. The argument is that the Maya pushed their environment beyond its carrying capacity and triggered an ecological collapse that made their civilization unsustainable. This theory has the appeal of making the Maya collapse a cautionary tale about environmental destruction that resonates with modern concerns about climate change and sustainability. But critics point out that the Maya had been practicing intensive agriculture for centuries without triggering collapse. Why would environmental problems that had been manageable for generations suddenly become catastrophic? The warfare theory focuses on the increasing violence and political instability that characterized the late Classic period. Archaeological evidence shows that Maya warfare became more frequent and more destructive. During the centuries leading up to the collapse, fortifications around cities became more elaborate, mass graves became more common, and inscriptions increasingly focus on military conflicts rather than peaceful achievements. Proponents of this theory argue that the Maya became trapped in a cycle of escalating violence that eventually consumed the resources and social cohesion necessary to maintain their civilization. The constant warfare disrupted trade networks, destroyed agricultural systems, and diverted resources from productive activities to military expenditures. Eventually, the costs of constant conflict became unsustainable. But the warfare theory faces the same problem as the environmental explanation. Maya civilization had always been characterized by frequent conflicts between competing cities. Why would warfare that had been a constant feature of Maya life for centuries suddenly become destructive enough to cause civilizational collapse? The disease theory suggests that epidemic diseases, possibly introduced through contact with other regions, devastated Maya populations during the collapse period. Skeletal evidence from Maya sites shows signs of nutritional stress and infectious disease during the late Classic period. The theory is that disease outbreaks, possibly combined with the effects of drought and famine, reduced Maya populations below the critical mass necessary to maintain their complex urban civilization. This theory gains support from what we know about the devastating impact of epidemic diseases on Native American populations after European contact. But the disease theory for the classic Maya collapse lacks the kind of direct evidence that supports the post-contact epidemics. We have no clear archaeological evidence of the massive mortality that would be expected from civilization-ending disease outbreaks. The social revolution theory proposes that the Maya collapse was caused by internal rebellion against the elite classes that had dominated Maya society for centuries. This theory suggests that the common people, faced with increasing demands for labor and resources to support elite lifestyles and religious ceremonies, eventually rose up against their rulers and destroyed the political and social systems that had oppressed them. Archaeological evidence for this theory includes the destruction of elite residential areas and the defacement of royal monuments at some Maya sites. The theory has ideological appeal for those who see the Maya collapse as a victory of the oppressed masses against their elite oppressors. But the evidence for widespread social revolution is limited, and the theory doesn't explain why successful rebellions would lead to complete abandonment rather than the establishment of new, more egalitarian social systems. The foreign invasion theory suggests that the Maya were conquered by outside groups, possibly from central Mexico or other regions. This theory points to evidence of foreign influence in Maya art and architecture during the late Classic period, as well as the presence of non-Maya artifacts at some sites. The argument is that foreign invaders disrupted Maya political systems and imposed new cultural practices that eventually led to the abandonment of traditional Maya cities. But the foreign invasion theory faces serious problems. There's no clear archaeological evidence of large-scale military conquest or foreign occupation of Maya cities. The foreign influences that appear in late Classic Maya art could just as easily be explained by increased trade and cultural exchange rather than conquest. The system's collapse theory, favored by many modern archaeologists, suggests that Maya civilization became so complex and interdependent that any significant disruption could trigger a cascade of failures that would bring down the entire system. This theory argues that the Maya had created a civilization that was simultaneously their greatest achievement and their greatest vulnerability. According to this theory, Maya civilization was like a house of cards, impressive and sophisticated, but so delicately balanced that the slightest disturbance could bring the whole structure crashing down. The drought, warfare, environmental degradation, and social tensions that characterized the late Classic period weren't separate problems, but interconnected crises that reinforced each other in a downward spiral that eventually became unstoppable. The system's collapse theory has the advantage of explaining why a civilization that had survived individual crises for centuries would suddenly succumb to what might seem like manageable problems. It also explains why the collapse was so complete and why recovery proved impossible. Once the complex systems that supported Maya civilization broke down, the knowledge and resources necessary to rebuild them were lost. But even the system's collapse theory leaves important questions unanswered. Why did some Maya regions collapse while others continued to flourish? Why were the Maya unable to adapt their systems to changing conditions? Why was the collapse so sudden and complete rather than gradual and partial? The truth is that after more than a century of research, we still don't have a completely satisfactory explanation for the Maya collapse. Each theory explains some aspects of the evidence while leaving others unexplained. The most likely scenario is that the collapse resulted from a combination of factors: drought, environmental degradation, warfare, disease, social tensions, and systems failure, all working together to create a perfect storm of civilizational destruction. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Maya collapse theories is what they reveal about the fragility of human civilization. Whether the Maya were destroyed by climate change, environmental degradation, warfare, disease, social revolution, foreign invasion, or systems collapse, the message is the same. Even the most sophisticated and successful civilizations can disappear with shocking suddenness. The theories that attempt to explain the Maya collapse aren't just academic exercises. They're warnings about the vulnerabilities that lurk beneath the surface of all human societies. The Maya had science, art, literature, and technology that in many ways surpassed anything their contemporaries could imagine. If they could vanish so completely, what does that say about the permanence of our own achievements? Standing in the ruins of their cities, surrounded by the remnants of their impossible achievements, we're forced to confront the possibility that all our theories about why civilizations collapse might someday be applied to our own. The Maya thought they had built something eternal, something that would last as long as the stars they studied so carefully. They were wrong, and the jungle-covered pyramids that mark their graves serve as monuments to the dangerous illusion of permanence that seems to afflict every civilization that has ever believed it was too sophisticated to fail. The most haunting aspect of the Maya collapse isn't what disappeared, it's what survived. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan in the 16th century, they found thriving Maya communities with hundreds of thousands of people living just kilometers away from the greatest archaeological treasures in the Americas. These weren't the descendants of some other people who had moved into abandoned Maya territory. These were Maya, speaking Maya languages, practicing Maya customs, worshipping Maya gods. But they had no idea that their ancestors had built Tikal, Calakmul, or Palenque. The amnesia was so complete, it defies comprehension. Imagine if the descendants of Romans living in modern Italy had no memory of the Colosseum, no knowledge that their ancestors had built aqueducts and roads that spanned continents, no awareness that Rome had ever been anything more than a small Italian city. That's essentially what happened to the Maya. A civilization that had kept meticulous historical records for over years had somehow erased its own memory so thoroughly that its own descendants became strangers to their greatest achievements. Spanish chroniclers like Diego de Landa, who arrived in the Yucatan in the 1540s, were amazed by this cultural amnesia. They found Maya communities that possessed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and agriculture, but who seemed completely unaware of the massive ruins that lay hidden in the jungle around them. When Spanish explorers asked about the great stone cities, Maya guides would shrug and say they had always been there, built by giants or gods in some mythical past that had no connection to their own history. The Maya who survived the collapse weren't primitive people who had lost their culture entirely. They maintained complex religious systems, sophisticated agricultural techniques, and detailed knowledge of astronomy and timekeeping. They could still read some hieroglyphs and perform elaborate ceremonies. They had preserved oral traditions that contained fragments of ancient mythology and historical memory. But somehow, The connection between their living culture and the abandoned cities had been completely severed. This cultural amnesia wasn't the result of gradual forgetting over many generations. The time gap between the collapse of the classic Maya cities and the Spanish conquest was only about 600 years, roughly equivalent to the time between the construction of Notre Dame Cathedral and today. If European civilization had collapsed in the 14th century, we would still expect people living in Paris today to have some memory of who built the great cathedral that dominates their city. The Maya had forgotten their greatest achievements in a span of time that should have preserved at least some cultural memory. The survivors of the Maya collapse had reorganized themselves into smaller, more dispersed communities that were better adapted to the post-collapse environment. Instead of the massive urban centers that had characterized classic Maya civilization, they lived in smaller towns and villages that could be sustained by local resources. Instead of the complex political hierarchies that had governed the great cities, they developed simpler social organizations based on kinship and local leadership. These post-collapse Maya communities were remarkably successful in their own right. They developed new agricultural techniques that were more sustainable than the intensive farming that had supported the classic cities. They created trade networks that connected communities across the Yucatan Peninsula and beyond. They built new ceremonial centers that, while smaller than the classic pyramids, were still impressive architectural achievements. But they had also developed what can only be described as a cultural defense mechanism against the kind of complexity that had destroyed their ancestors. Post-collapse, Maya society seems to have deliberately avoided the kind of centralized authority, massive construction projects, and resource-intensive ceremonies that had characterized the classic period. It was as if they had learned, perhaps unconsciously, that such complexity was dangerous. The religious systems of the surviving Maya communities show clear continuities with classic period beliefs, but also significant changes that suggest a conscious rejection of some aspects of their ancestors' practices. Human sacrifice continued, but on a much smaller scale. Astronomical observations were maintained, but without the massive observatories and complex calculations that had characterized classic Maya science. The calendar systems were preserved, but simplified. Most tellingly, the post-collapse Maya seem to have deliberately avoided creating the kind of permanent historical records that had been such an important feature of classic Maya civilization. While they maintained the ability to write and continue to use hieroglyphs for some purposes, they stopped creating the elaborate historical inscriptions that had documented the achievements of classic Maya rulers. It was as if they had decided that remembering too much about the past was dangerous. The Spanish conquest brought new disruptions to Maya communities that had already survived one civilizational collapse. European diseases devastated populations that had no immunity to Old World pathogens. Spanish colonial policies disrupted traditional social and economic systems. Christian missionaries worked to suppress Maya religious practices and destroy Maya books and monuments. But even the Spanish conquest didn't completely destroy Maya culture. Maya communities adapted to colonial rule while maintaining many of their traditional practices. They learned Spanish and adopted Christianity while continuing to speak Maya languages and practice Maya customs. They worked within the colonial system while preserving their own social organizations and cultural identities. The irony is that the Spanish conquest, devastating as it was, preserved more knowledge about classic Maya civilization than the Maya themselves had maintained. Spanish chroniclers recorded Maya oral traditions and described Maya customs that might otherwise have been lost. Spanish priests, even as they destroyed Maya books, sometimes recorded their contents or described their significance. Spanish colonial records documented Maya communities and practices that provide crucial information about the continuities and changes between classic and post-classic Maya culture. Modern Maya communities, numbering in the millions across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, represent an unbroken cultural tradition that stretches back over 3,000 years. They speak languages that are directly descended from those spoken by the builders of Tikal and Palenque. They practice agricultural techniques that have roots in classic Maya farming methods. They maintain religious beliefs and ceremonial practices that show clear connections to classic Maya religion. But the connection between modern Maya communities and the great archaeological sites in their territories remains tenuous. While some Maya communities have developed a sense of pride in their ancestors' achievements, many still view the ruins as the products of a different people from a different time. The cultural amnesia that followed the classic collapse has never been completely overcome. This amnesia represents one of the most profound losses in human history. The Maya had developed one of the world's most sophisticated writing systems, but the knowledge of how to read it was so completely lost that modern scholars had spent over a century trying to decipher it. They had created mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time, but most of this knowledge disappeared with the collapse. They had developed architectural and engineering techniques that allowed them to build some of humanity's most impressive monuments, but the specific knowledge of how these techniques worked was lost. The survivors who forgot represent both the resilience and the tragedy of human culture. They show that societies can survive even the most catastrophic collapses, that human communities can adapt and rebuild even after losing everything that once defined them. But they also show how completely knowledge and memory can be lost, how even the greatest achievements can be forgotten by the very people whose ancestors created them. The Maya who survived the collapse weren't failures or primitives who had lost their culture. They were successful adapters who had learned to live within the limits of their environment and avoid the kind of complexity that had destroyed their ancestors. But in learning to survive, they had also learned to forget, and in forgetting, they had lost something irreplaceable about what it means to be human. The amnesia of the Maya survivors is a warning about the fragility of cultural memory and the ease with which even the greatest human achievements can slip into oblivion. It reminds us that survival and memory are not the same thing, and that a culture can continue to exist long after it has forgotten what made it great. Nature is patient, but it never forgets a debt. For over 1,000 years, the Maya had held back the jungle through sheer force of will, turning rainforest into farmland, swamp into cities, and chaos into one of humanity's most sophisticated civilizations. They had carved their achievements from a landscape that seemed designed to resist human habitation, and for centuries it appeared they had one. But when the cities emptied and the people fled, the jungle began to collect what it was owed, with interest compounded over centuries of suppressed growth. The speed with which the rainforest reclaimed Maya cities is almost supernatural in its efficiency. Within decades of abandonment, buildings that had taken generations to construct were being pulled apart by roots and vines. The carefully fitted stones of pyramid walls were pried loose by tree roots that grew with the slow, inexorable force of geological time. Palace facades that had been decorated with elaborate sculptures were hidden behind curtains of vegetation so thick that the buildings themselves became invisible. The jungle didn't just cover the Maya ruins, it actively dismantled them. Strangler figs, those patient assassins of the rainforest, wrapped themselves around temple walls and slowly crushed them as they grew. Cecropia trees, fast-growing pioneers of disturbed areas, sprouted from cracks in pyramid steps and split apart the stonework with their expanding trunks. Vines, thick as a person's waist, pulled down carved lintels and toppled stelae that had stood for centuries. But the jungle's revenge wasn't just physical, it was also biological. The Maya had spent centuries modifying the rainforest ecosystem to serve their needs, creating artificial environments that could support massive human populations. When those populations disappeared, the ecosystem began to revert to its natural state. But the process wasn't simple restoration. It was more like a biological explosion. A species that had been suppressed for generations suddenly found themselves free to reclaim territory that had been denied to them for centuries. The agricultural areas that had once fed millions of Maya were among the first casualties of the jungle's return. The carefully maintained milpa fields that had been the foundation of Maya civilization were quickly overrun by secondary forest growth. The terraces that had prevented erosion and conserved soil were broken apart by root systems and washed away by rains that no longer had human-built drainage systems to control them. The water management systems that had been Maya engineering's greatest achievement became the jungle's most effective weapons against human construction. Without constant maintenance, the elaborate networks of canals, reservoirs, and drainage systems quickly failed. Dams broke, channels silted up, and the carefully controlled flow of water that had sustained Maya cities became wild streams that carved new paths through the ruins. The reservoirs that had once provided clean water for hundreds of thousands of people became stagnant pools that bred mosquitoes and other disease vectors. The canals that had transported goods and people across the Maya world became overgrown waterways that were impassable to human traffic. The drainage systems that had prevented flooding during the rainy season collapsed, turning former city centers into seasonal swamps. Animals that had been hunted to near extinction around Maya cities began to return in numbers that hadn't been seen for centuries. Jaguars, the apex predators of the rainforest, reclaimed territories that had been denied to them for generations. Howler monkeys, whose calls had once competed with human voices in Maya cities, now had the ruins to themselves. Tapirs, peccaries, and deer moved through former palace courtyards where Maya nobles had once held court. The bird life that returned to the abandoned cities was particularly dramatic. Species that had been driven away by human activity came flooding back, turning the empty temples into rookeries and nesting sites. Parrots and toucans, whose colorful feathers had once been prized by Maya nobles, now flew freely through palace windows and nested in the cracks between stones. But perhaps the most poetic aspect of the jungle's revenge was how it transformed Maya monuments into something entirely new. Pyramids that had once been stark geometric statements of human power over nature became living sculptures, their surfaces softened by moss and ferns, their sharp edges blurred by vegetation. Temples that had been designed to reach toward the heavens became part of the forest canopy, their tops indistinguishable from the surrounding trees. The jungle didn't just destroy Maya architecture, it incorporated it into the ecosystem in ways that created new forms of beauty. Tree roots flowed over carved stones like living water, creating organic sculptures that combined human artistry with natural growth. Vines draped palace walls like green tapestries, softening the harsh lines of stone with the gentle curves of living growth. The transformation was so complete that when European explorers began to rediscover Maya ruins in the 19th century, they often couldn't tell where architecture ended and nature began. Temples had become hills covered with vegetation. Palaces had become mysterious mounds that revealed their artificial nature only when excavated. Entire cities had disappeared so completely under jungle growth that they were invisible even to people walking directly over them. The jungle's revenge also extended to the knowledge systems that had been Maya civilization's greatest achievement. The bark paper books that had preserved centuries of Maya learning were particularly vulnerable to the humid tropical climate. Without the controlled environment of occupied buildings and the care of human custodians, these libraries rotted away within decades of abandonment. The astronomical observatories that had allowed Maya scientists to track planetary movements and predict eclipses were quickly overgrown by vegetation that blocked their carefully calculated sightlines. The calendar stones and mathematical inscriptions that had recorded Maya achievements in science were covered by moss and lichen that made them unreadable. Even the stone monuments that were durable enough to survive the physical assault of jungle growth were often rendered meaningless by the loss of the cultural context that had given them significance. Hieroglyphic inscriptions that had once proclaimed the achievements of Maya rulers became mysterious symbols that no one could read. Sculptural programs that had told complex stories about gods and heroes became abstract decorations whose meaning was lost. The irony of the jungle's revenge is that it preserved Maya ruins, even as it destroyed them. The vegetation that pulled apart the buildings also protected them from human vandalism and natural erosion. The isolation that made the ruins inaccessible also kept them safe from treasure hunters and stone robbers. The jungle that had been Maya civilization's greatest enemy became the guardian of its remains. When archaeologists finally began to systematically explore Maya ruins in the 20th century, they found that the jungle had created a kind of time capsule. Buildings that had been abandoned over 1,000 years ago were preserved in remarkable detail, their carved decorations protected by the very vegetation that had hidden them from view. But the jungle's protection came at a cost. The process of excavating Maya ruins requires destroying the very ecosystem that has preserved them. Every tree that is cut down to reveal a pyramid, every vine that is cleared to expose a carved inscription, represents a small victory of human curiosity over natural process. The archaeologists who study Maya ruins are forced to become agents of the same kind of environmental destruction that may have contributed to the original collapse. The jungle's revenge on Maya civilization is a reminder of the temporary nature of all human achievements. The pyramids that seemed so permanent, the cities that appeared so enduring, the knowledge that felt so secure, all proved to be ephemeral when measured against the patient persistence of natural processes. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges and contemplate the sustainability of our own civilization, the jungle-covered ruins of the Maya serve as a powerful reminder of nature's ultimate authority. We may build cities and create technologies that seem to give us control over the natural world, but the jungle is always waiting, patient and persistent, ready to reclaim what we have temporarily borrowed from the earth. The Maya thought they had conquered the rainforest, but in the end, the rainforest conquered them. Their greatest monuments have become part of the ecosystem they once sought to control, and their most sophisticated achievements have been reduced to mysterious mounds in the jungle. The revenge of the rainforest was complete, total, and ultimately, strangely beautiful in its thoroughness. In 1839, a young American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens was hacking through the jungles of Honduras when he stumbled upon something that would shatter everything Europeans thought they knew about the New World. Rising from the green chaos of the rainforest were stone monuments covered with intricate carvings, their surfaces decorated with hieroglyphs that looked nothing like anything in the Old World. Stephens was looking at the ruins of Copan, one of the greatest Maya cities, but he had no idea what he was seeing. No one did. The Maya had hidden their secrets so well that even finding their cities would prove to be just the beginning of a mystery that would take over a century to solve. The early explorers who rediscovered Maya ruins weren't archaeologists in any modern sense. They were adventurers, treasure hunters, and amateur antiquarians who approached the jungle-covered monuments with more enthusiasm than scientific method. They were looking for gold and jade, not knowledge, and their techniques would make modern archaeologists weep. They blasted through temple walls with dynamite, hauled away carved stones to sell to museums, and destroyed more archaeological evidence in a few decades than the jungle had managed to eliminate in centuries. But even these crude early efforts began to reveal the scope of what had been lost. The Maya hadn't built a few isolated temples. They had created an entire civilization. City after city emerged from the jungle as explorers pushed deeper into the rainforest. Tikal, Palenque, Jaxilan, Bonampak. Each discovery revealed new aspects of Maya achievement and deepened the mystery of what had happened to the people who built them. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that covered Maya monuments were particularly maddening. Here was clearly a sophisticated writing system, but no one could read it. The Spanish had destroyed most Maya books during the conquest, and the few that survived were written in a script that seemed to bear no relationship to any known writing system. Early scholars tried to apply Old World decipherment techniques, looking for connections to Egyptian hieroglyphs or Chinese characters, but the Maya script stubbornly refused to yield its secrets. The breakthrough came in the 1950s when a young Russian scholar named Yuri Norisov made a crucial insight. Previous scholars had assumed that Maya hieroglyphs were purely logographic, with each symbol representing a complete word or concept. Norisov realized that the Maya script was actually a mixed system that combined logographic symbols with phonetic elements that represented sounds rather than meanings. This insight opened the floodgates of Maya decipherment. Scholars began to read the inscriptions that had been staring at them from temple walls for over a century. What they found was revolutionary. The Maya hadn't just built impressive monuments. They had created a literate civilization that had kept detailed historical records for over 600 years. The inscriptions weren't just religious texts or astronomical observations. They were chronicles of real people who had lived real lives in the cities that archaeologists were excavating. Suddenly, Maya rulers, who had been anonymous builders of mysterious monuments, became historical figures with names, dates, and documented achievements. Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, Jasor Chan Kaawil of Tikal, Kainich Janab Pakal of Palenque. These weren't mythical figures, but real people whose lives and deaths were recorded in stone. The Maya had left behind their own history, written in their own words, and archaeologists were finally learning to read it. But reading the inscriptions only deepened the mystery of the collapse. The historical records showed a civilization at the height of its power and sophistication, right up until the moment it disappeared. There were no warnings of impending doom, no records of environmental catastrophe, no accounts of foreign invasion or internal rebellion. The inscriptions simply stopped, as if the scribes had put down their chisels in the middle of a sentence and walked away forever. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed details about Maya civilization that would have seemed like science fiction to early explorers. Ground-penetrating radar can map entire cities without removing a single tree. LiDAR technology can see through jungle canopy to reveal architectural features that have been hidden for centuries. Satellite imagery can identify Maya sites from space by detecting subtle variations in vegetation that mark the locations of buried structures. These new technologies have revolutionized our understanding of Maya civilization. What early explorers thought were isolated ceremonial centers have been revealed as massive urban complexes that housed hundreds of thousands of people. The jungle that seemed empty to 19th century explorers has been shown to contain a continuous landscape of Maya settlements, roads, and agricultural features. But the new discoveries have also made the mystery of the collapse even more puzzling. The more we learn about Maya achievements, the harder it becomes to understand how such a sophisticated civilization could simply vanish. The Maya had developed sustainable agricultural techniques, sophisticated water management systems, and complex political organizations that had functioned successfully for over 1,000 years. Why did they suddenly stop working? Archaeological evidence from the collapse period tells a story that is both clear and incomprehensible. The cities were abandoned suddenly and completely. People left behind valuable possessions, unfinished construction projects, and half-completed inscriptions. There's no evidence of foreign conquest, massive natural disasters, or gradual decline. The Maya simply stopped being Maya, at least in the way they had been for over a millennium. The detective work of modern archaeologists has revealed some clues about what might have happened. Environmental data shows evidence of severe drought during the collapse period. Skeletal remains reveal signs of malnutrition and disease. Fortifications around cities suggest increasing warfare and social instability. But none of these factors, alone or in combination, seem sufficient to explain the complete collapse of an entire civilization. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the Maya mystery is how much we still don't know. despite over a century of intensive research. We can read Maya inscriptions, but most Maya books were destroyed, and the oral traditions that preserved Maya knowledge were broken during the collapse. We can excavate Maya cities, but the jungle has destroyed or hidden much of the evidence we need to understand how Maya society actually functioned. The archaeologists who study Maya civilization have become detectives investigating a crime scene that is over 1,000 years old. They have the physical evidence. They have some of the written records. They even have some of the suspects. But the witnesses are all dead. The crime scene has been contaminated by centuries of jungle growth, and the motive remains unclear. Modern Maya archaeology is a race against time. The same forces that destroyed Maya civilization are still at work. Deforestation, development, and climate change are destroying Maya sites faster than archaeologists can study them. Looters and treasure hunters continue to damage sites and steal artifacts. Political instability in some Maya regions makes archaeological work dangerous or impossible. But perhaps the greatest challenge facing Maya archaeologists is the sheer scope of what they're trying to understand. Maya civilization wasn't a single culture, but a complex mosaic of related societies that developed over more than 2 millennia across an area larger than modern Germany. Understanding the Maya collapse requires understanding not just what happened in individual cities, but how the complex systems that connected those cities broke down. The archaeologists who became detectives in the Maya mystery have solved many puzzles and answered many questions. They've revealed the sophistication of Maya science, the complexity of Maya society, and the beauty of Maya art. They've given names and faces to Maya rulers and documented the rise and fall of Maya dynasties. But the central mystery remains unsolved. How does a civilization that had mastered mathematics, astronomy, and engineering simply disappear? How do people who had built some of humanity's most impressive monuments abandon them and walk away? How does knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate vanish so completely that even the descendants of its creators forget it ever existed? The Maya collapse remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of how civilizations rise and fall. The detectives who study it have gathered the evidence, analyzed the clues, and proposed their theories. But the case remains open, and the jungle keeps its secrets as jealously as it has for over 1,000 years. There's something deeply unsettling about standing in a Maya city at dusk, when the shadows grow long and the jungle sounds begin their nightly symphony. The empty doorways seem to watch you with hollow eyes. The vacant windows stare back with the blank gaze of the dead, and the silence between the howler monkey calls feels pregnant with the whispers of voices that will never speak again. This isn't just the romantic melancholy that ruins often inspire. This is something darker, more profound. These cities aren't just empty. They're haunted by the ghosts of a civilization that died so completely that even its own descendants forgot it ever existed. The ghosts that haunt Maya ruins aren't supernatural spirits. They're the phantom traces of human systems that once functioned with clockwork precision but now exist only as archaeological shadows. Walk through the residential areas of Tikal and you can almost see the daily routines that once animated these spaces. Families gathering for meals in courtyards that are now choked with vegetation. Children playing games in plazas that are now silent except for the rustle of leaves. Merchants hawking their wares in marketplaces that are now home only to iguanas and cotamundis. The most haunting ghosts are those of the knowledge systems that once made Maya civilization possible. Stand in the ruins of the observatory at Karakol and try to imagine the astronomers who once used these carefully aligned windows to track the movements of Venus across the night sky. Their calculations were so precise that they could predict planetary conjunctions centuries in advance. Yet they apparently never saw their own civilization's end approaching. The scribal schools, where young Maya nobles learned to read and write, are now empty chambers filled only with the debris of centuries. but you can still see the stone benches where students once sat, the niches where they stored their bark paper books, the walls where they practiced their hieroglyphs. The knowledge that was transmitted in these rooms was so sophisticated that modern scholars are still struggling to understand it fully. Yet it vanished so completely that within a few generations, no one remembered it had ever existed. Perhaps the most poignant ghosts are those of the children who never grew up to inherit their civilization. Maya cities were full of young people, as all healthy societies are. Archaeological evidence shows that Maya populations had the demographic profile of a growing, thriving civilization right up until the moment of collapse. There were children learning to read, teenagers training to become priests and scribes, young adults preparing to take their places in the complex hierarchies that governed Maya society. But those children never became adults in the civilization that had shaped their early years. The teenagers never became the priests and scribes they were training to be. The young adults never inherited the positions their education had prepared them for. Instead, they became the last generation of a dying world, carrying knowledge and skills that would die with them because there was no longer a society that needed what they had learned. The ghosts of Maya technology are equally haunting. The water management systems that had sustained hundreds of thousands of people for centuries are now broken networks of empty channels and silted reservoirs. But you can still trace their outlines, still see the sophisticated engineering that made them work, still marvel at the precision with which they were designed and built. The knowledge of how to maintain these systems was so specialized that when the engineers who possessed it died or fled, the systems simply stopped working. The agricultural terraces that had fed millions of people are now overgrown with jungle vegetation, but their stone retaining walls still march up the hillsides like the ribs of some enormous skeleton. The milpa fields that had been the foundation of Maya civilization have returned to forest, but you can still see the subtle variations in vegetation that mark where they once flourished. The knowledge of how to manage these agricultural systems was so complex that it took generations to master. Yet it was lost so quickly that even the descendants of Maya farmers forgot how their ancestors had fed such large populations. The ghosts of Maya political systems are perhaps the most complex and mysterious. The palaces where Maya rulers once held court are now empty shells, their elaborate throne rooms and audience chambers silent, except for the drip of water and the scurry of small animals. But the architectural programs that decorated these spaces still tell stories of divine kingship, cosmic order, and political legitimacy that no one alive fully understands. The ball courts where Maya elites played ritual games that determined matters of life and death are now overgrown playing fields, where the only sounds are the caws of birds and the rustle of wind through empty stone rings. The knowledge of the rules that governed these games, the meanings of the rituals that surrounded them, and the political implications of their outcomes died with the last players who understood their significance. The most disturbing ghosts are those of the religious systems that had given meaning and structure to Maya life for over a millennium. The temples where priests once performed daily ceremonies to maintain cosmic order are now empty chambers where the only offerings are the flowers that occasionally fall from overhanging trees. The altars where human hearts were once offered to hungry gods are now stained only by rainwater and bird droppings. The knowledge of how to perform the elaborate ceremonies that had been the foundation of Maya religion was so specialized and so closely guarded that when the priests who possessed it died or fled, the rituals simply stopped. The cosmic order that Maya rulers had claimed to maintain through their religious performances was revealed to be as fragile as the human voices that had proclaimed it. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the ghosts that inhabit Maya ruins is how recently they died. The collapse of Maya civilization wasn't an ancient event that happened in some remote prehistoric past. It occurred during what Europeans call the Middle Ages, at a time when other civilizations were building cathedrals and writing epic poems and developing new forms of art and literature. The Maya collapse was a contemporary event that happened while other human societies were thriving and growing. This temporal proximity makes the ghosts of Maya civilization particularly unsettling. These weren't primitive people who failed to adapt to changing conditions. These were sophisticated, intelligent, creative human beings who had built one of the world's most advanced civilizations. They had science, art, literature, and technology that in many ways surpassed anything their contemporaries could imagine. Yet they vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The ghosts that haunt Maya ruins are reminders of how quickly and completely human achievements can disappear. The knowledge systems that had taken centuries to develop were lost in decades. The political institutions that had governed millions of people simply evaporated. The religious beliefs that had given meaning to countless lives were abandoned and forgotten. Modern visitors to Maya ruins often report feeling watched, as if invisible presences were observing them from the empty doorways and vacant windows of abandoned buildings. This feeling isn't supernatural, it's psychological. We're being watched by the ghosts of our own mortality, by the phantom traces of human ambition and achievement that remind us how temporary all our accomplishments really are. The Maya built their cities to last forever, but forever turned out to be shorter than they expected. They created knowledge systems that they believed would endure as long as the stars they studied so carefully. But those systems proved as mortal as the human minds that created them. They established political and religious institutions that they thought would maintain cosmic order for all eternity. But eternity ended with shocking suddenness. The ghosts in the machine of Maya civilization are the phantom traces of human confidence in the permanence of human achievement. They remind us that all our cities, all our knowledge, all our institutions are as fragile as the voices that proclaim their importance. They whisper that civilizations, like people, can die, and when they do, they leave behind only ruins and mysteries for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Standing in a Maya city at dusk, surrounded by the ghosts of a lost world, you can't help but wonder what future archaeologists will make of our own ruins, what mysteries our own collapse will leave behind, and whether our own ghosts will haunt the machines we've built with the same melancholy silence that fills the empty temples of the Maya. The Maya collapse isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting our own civilization's vulnerabilities with uncomfortable clarity. As we stand at the edge of our own environmental crisis, facing climate change, resource depletion, and social instability that would have been familiar to Maya rulers in their final decades, the lessons from the abyss that swallowed Maya civilization become more than academic curiosities. They become warnings written in stone and blood about the price of believing that sophistication equals sustainability. The first lesson is perhaps the most disturbing. Intelligence doesn't guarantee survival. The Maya were brilliant. They developed mathematical concepts that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. They created astronomical observations that rival modern precision. They built architectural marvels that still inspire awe today. Yet all of this intellectual achievement proved utterly useless when their civilization faced existential crisis. Their sophisticated understanding of cosmic cycles couldn't help them when earthly cycles of drought and famine disrupted their carefully balanced systems. This should terrify us. We live in an age that worships intelligence and technological innovation as solutions to all problems. We believe that our scientific knowledge and technological capabilities make us immune to the kinds of collapses that destroyed previous civilizations. But the Maya had science too. They had technology too. They had knowledge systems that were in many ways more sophisticated than anything their contemporaries possessed. It didn't save them. The second lesson is about the danger of complexity. Maya civilization was a marvel of interconnected systems, agricultural techniques that could support massive populations, water management systems that could sustain cities in the rainforest, political networks that could coordinate activities across hundreds of kilometers, religious ideologies that could motivate incredible achievements. But this complexity was also their greatest vulnerability. When the systems that supported Maya's civilization began to fail, the interconnections that had been their strength became weaknesses that amplified every problem. Drought didn't just reduce agricultural output, it triggered cascading failures in water management, political stability, and religious authority. The more sophisticated their systems became, the more vulnerable they were to disruption. Our own civilization is far more complex than anything the Maya ever imagined. We depend on global supply chains, electronic communication networks, and financial systems that span continents. We've created interdependencies that make Maya political networks look simple by comparison. If complexity was a vulnerability for the Maya, what does that say about our own chances of surviving major disruptions? The third lesson is about the tyranny of success. Maya civilization was so successful for so long that it became trapped by its own achievements. The agricultural techniques that had allowed them to support unprecedented populations also made them vulnerable when environmental conditions changed. The political systems that had coordinated their expansion also prevented them from adapting when coordination became a liability. The religious ideologies that had motivated their greatest achievements also prevented them from questioning those achievements when they stopped working. Success breeds conservatism. When systems work well for centuries, questioning them becomes not just difficult, but dangerous. Maya rulers who suggested abandoning traditional practices would have been seen as impious and potentially treasonous. The very success of their civilization made it impossible to change course when change became necessary for survival. We face the same trap. Our economic systems, political institutions, and technological infrastructure have been so successful that questioning them seems almost unthinkable. We've built our entire civilization around assumptions about growth, consumption, and resource exploitation that may be fundamentally unsustainable. But these assumptions are so deeply embedded in our systems that changing them would require dismantling much of what we've built. The fourth lesson is about the speed of collapse. Maya civilization didn't decline gradually over centuries. It collapsed suddenly, within a few decades, despite having been stable and successful for over a millennium. This pattern of sudden collapse after long periods of stability is more common in history than we'd like to admit. Complex systems often appear stable right up until the moment they fail catastrophically. This should make us deeply uncomfortable about our own situation. Our civilization appears stable and successful, just as Maya civilization did in 800 CE. Our cities are growing, our technology is advancing, our knowledge is expanding. But the Maya were also building bigger pyramids and commissioning more elaborate monuments right up until the moment their cities were abandoned. Apparent success is not a guarantee against sudden collapse. The fifth lesson is about the importance of environmental limits. The Maya pushed their environment to its absolute limits and beyond. They supported population densities that required intensive agriculture, extensive deforestation, and complex water management. When environmental conditions changed, they had no margin for error. Their civilization had become so dependent on environmental exploitation that any disruption in natural systems triggered civilizational collapse. We've pushed our own environment far beyond anything the Maya ever imagined. We've altered the global climate, depleted natural resources on a planetary scale, and created pollution problems that affect every ecosystem on Earth. We've built a civilization that requires constant growth and increasing consumption of finite resources. The Maya, at least, had the excuse of not knowing about environmental limits. We have no such excuse. The sixth lesson is about the fragility of knowledge. Maya civilization possessed sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and agriculture. But this knowledge was concentrated in the hands of a small elite and transmitted through systems that proved vulnerable to disruption. When Maya civilization collapsed, most of this knowledge was lost forever. Our own knowledge systems are both more robust and more fragile than those of the Maya. We have books, computers, and global communication networks that can preserve and transmit information in ways the Maya never imagined. But we also have knowledge that is increasingly specialized and dependent on complex technological infrastructure. How much of our scientific and technical knowledge would survive if our electronic systems failed? How many people actually understand the technologies that our civilization depends on? The seventh and perhaps most important lesson is about the danger of believing in our own permanence. Maya rulers commissioned monuments that were designed to last forever. They created calendar systems that could track dates across millions of years. They built their civilization as if it would endure as long as the stars they studied so carefully. This belief in their own permanence may have prevented them from taking the kinds of radical action that might have saved them. We suffer from the same delusion. We build cities in flood zones and earthquake zones, as if natural disasters will never happen. We create economic systems based on infinite growth on a finite planet, as if the laws of physics don't apply to us. We treat environmental problems as if they're someone else's responsibility, and climate change as if it's a distant threat rather than a present reality. The Maya collapse teaches us that civilizations are mortal. They can die, and when they do, they often die quickly and completely. The sophistication that we're so proud of, the knowledge that we've accumulated, the institutions that we've built, all of these are as fragile as the human societies that created them. But the Maya collapse also teaches us that collapse isn't inevitable. Some Maya communities survived by adapting to changing conditions, by simplifying their systems, by learning to live within environmental limits. The question is whether we can learn from their example before it's too late, whether we can change course before we follow them into the abyss. The lessons from the Maya abyss are written in stone and preserved in the jungle for anyone willing to read them. They tell us that intelligence without wisdom is useless, that complexity without resilience is dangerous, that success without sustainability is temporary. They remind us that civilizations, like people, can die, and that the only way to avoid their fate is to learn from their mistakes before we repeat them. The Maya thought they had built something eternal. They were wrong. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from their error or doomed to repeat it. We've reached the end of our journey through the ruins of Maya civilization, but like the jungle-covered pyramids that still pierce the canopy of the Petan rainforest, some mysteries refuse to stay buried. The Maya collapse isn't just a historical curiosity or an archaeological puzzle. It's a warning that echoes across the centuries, growing louder with each passing year as our own civilization faces challenges that would have been terrifyingly familiar to the last kings of Tikal and Kalokmal. The echo of the Maya collapse reverberates through every aspect of our modern world. When we see images of abandoned cities in Syria or Venezuela, we're seeing the same pattern that played out in the Maya lowlands over 1,000 years ago. Sophisticated urban centers emptied by forces beyond their inhabitants' control. When we read about climate refugees fleeing drought and famine, we're witnessing the same desperate migrations that scattered Maya populations across Mesoamerica. When we watch political systems fail to address existential threats, we're observing the same institutional paralysis that prevented Maya rulers from adapting to changing conditions. The parallels are so precise, they're almost supernatural. Like the Maya, we've built a civilization that depends on complex, interconnected systems that we don't fully understand and can't completely control. Like the Maya, we've pushed our environment to its limits and beyond, creating conditions that may be unsustainable in the long term. Like the Maya, we've become so successful that we've forgotten how fragile our achievements really are. But perhaps the most chilling parallel is how completely the Maya disappeared from their own history. A civilization that had kept meticulous records for over 600 years simply stopped writing. Knowledge systems that had taken centuries to develop were abandoned within decades. Cultural traditions that had defined Maya identity for over a millennium were forgotten so thoroughly that even their own descendants lost track of their heritage. This cultural amnesia should terrify us more than any environmental catastrophe or political collapse. Civilizations can survive droughts, famines, wars, and even the fall of governments, but they cannot survive the loss of their own memory, their own knowledge, their own understanding of what made them great. When a civilization forgets itself, it ceases to exist, even if its people continue to live. We're already seeing signs of this cultural amnesia in our own society. How many people understand the scientific principles that make their smartphones work? How many could rebuild the technological infrastructure that supports modern life if it collapsed? How many know the historical and philosophical foundations that underlie our political and economic systems? We've created a civilization so complex that most of its inhabitants don't understand how it functions. The Maya collapse also reveals the terrible irony of human progress. The very achievements that lifted Maya civilization to unprecedented heights also created the conditions for its destruction. Their agricultural innovations allowed them to support massive populations that became unsustainable when environmental conditions changed. Their political sophistication created complex systems that became impossible to manage during crisis. Their religious achievements created ideological constraints that prevented adaptive responses to new challenges. We face the same irony. Our technological achievements have created global problems that require global solutions, but our political systems remain stubbornly local and national. Our economic success has created wealth and prosperity for billions of people, but it has also created environmental problems that threaten the foundations of that prosperity. Our scientific knowledge has given us unprecedented understanding of the challenges we face, but our social and political institutions seem incapable of acting on that knowledge. The echo of the Maya collapse grows louder every time we choose short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Every time we prioritize economic growth over environmental protection. Every time we allow political ideology to override scientific evidence. It reverberates through every climate summit that fails to produce meaningful action. Every environmental report that documents accelerating degradation. Every political crisis that reveals the fragility of our institutions. But the echo also carries a message of hope. The Maya collapse wasn't inevitable. Some Maya communities survived by adapting to changing conditions, by simplifying their systems, by learning to live within environmental limits. The descendants of the Maya are still here, still speaking Maya languages, still practicing Maya customs, still maintaining connections to the land that sustained their ancestors for thousands of years. The survivors teach us that resilience is possible, that adaptation is achievable, that collapse doesn't have to be the end of the story. But they also teach us that survival often requires abandoning the very achievements that we're most proud of, accepting losses that seem unthinkable, and changing in ways that challenge our fundamental assumptions about who we are and what we value. The question that haunts the ruins of Maya civilization is whether we're capable of learning from their example before it's too late. Can we change course before we follow them into the abyss? Can we adapt our systems before they collapse under their own weight? Can we choose sustainability over growth, resilience over efficiency, wisdom over cleverness? The Maya had science, art, literature, and technology that in many ways surpassed anything their contemporaries could imagine. They built cities that were marvels of engineering and urban planning. They created knowledge systems that were centuries ahead of their time. They achieved things that should have guaranteed their civilization's survival for millennia. But they also created a system so complex, so dependent on perfect conditions, so resistant to change, that when crisis came, they couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. We have science, art, literature, and technology that would seem like magic to the Maya. We've built cities that dwarf their greatest achievements. We've created knowledge systems that span the globe and reach into space. We've achieved things that should guarantee our civilization's survival for millennia. But we've also created systems that are even more complex, even more dependent on perfect conditions, even more resistant to change than anything the Maya ever imagined. The echo of the Maya collapse is a warning, but it's also a choice. We can listen to that echo and learn from their mistakes, or we can ignore it and repeat their errors. We can choose adaptation over rigidity, sustainability over growth, wisdom over cleverness, or we can continue on our current path and discover for ourselves what the last Maya kings learned in their empty palaces, that all human achievements are temporary, that all civilizations are mortal, and that the jungle is always patient, always waiting, always ready to reclaim what we have temporarily borrowed from the earth. The Maya collapse happened over 1,000 years ago, but its echo grows stronger every day. It whispers to us from the jungle-covered ruins of Tikal and Calakmul, from the empty palaces of Palenque and Yaxchilan, from the silent ball courts and abandoned temples that marked the graves of a civilization that thought it would last forever. The echo asks us a simple question: will we learn from their example, or will we become another echo in the ruins? Another warning for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Another civilization that achieved the impossible only to discover that the impossible comes with a price that eventually must be paid. The Maya are gone, but their echo remains. It's up to us to decide whether we'll listen to it while there's still time to change course, or whether we'll add our own voices to the chorus of civilizations that learned too late that sophistication is not the same as wisdom, that complexity is not the same as resilience, and that believing in your own permanence is the first step toward ensuring your own destruction. The echo that never dies is calling to us from the ruins of the Maya world. The question is whether we're wise enough to hear it, brave enough to heed it, and strong enough to change before it's too late. The jungle is patient, but it never forgets a debt, and we owe it more than we can possibly imagine. The mysterious disappearance of the Maya civilization remains one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles, a reminder that even the most sophisticated societies can vanish with shocking suddenness. Their ruins stand as monuments to human achievement and warnings about human fragility, echoing across the centuries with lessons we ignore at our own peril. In the end, the Maya didn't just disappear, they became a mirror reflecting our own civilization's vulnerabilities, a ghost story written in stone that grows more relevant with each passing day.